Good morning, everybody. That'll wake you up. My name is Keith Oval. I'm the mayor of the Village of Frankfort. We want to welcome all of you here to Frankfort. And we're very happy to be able to host any sort of training, but especially this morning. Something's very important to all of us. And we'll have a great session. Again, we're very happy to have you here. We hope that you'll come back and visit us in Frankfort in the future. And at this point, we'll keep those speeches very short, and let's turn it over and get the program going.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, everyone. My name is Linda Mastandria, and I am the director of CMAP's Regional ADA Planning and Local Safety, and I'm really excited to welcome you all here. I'm so pleased to see such a great turnout, and we find the day really educational and informative. And you will see all around the back of the room our staff, so if you need anything, CMAP staff, please just raise a hand for a moment so you can be identified. If you need anything at all, please just seek one of us out and we'll be happy to help. I too will keep the remarks brief. We're just very pleased that you're here today to learn all there is to know about the ADA. You're going to leave today ready to teach your own course, right, Travis? Yeah. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Travis and get the day started. Welcome, everyone, and hope you have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you, Linda. A couple of housekeeping items first. Bathrooms are down the main hallway. It will provide where check-in is. There is coffee and drinks in the back. At any time you have to leave. This is sort of a free-flowing conversation, so if you gotta go, feel free to go. Another item of note is that we are recording this session and it will be posted up on CMAP's website. Also on CMAP's website is going to be the PowerPoint. We're going to talk a lot today about links and help that's available for you guys. So within that PowerPoint, we'll have all the links and everything else for you guys to find. Just to get started here, my name is Travis Helmkamp. I'm a project manager at Oates Associates. We are sort of the lead on this multi-year effort that CMAP's taking on to help and spread the knowledge of ADA. Our goal here today is to provide knowledge, but is also to answer questions. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them. We're going to take breaks throughout for questions. So if we aren't talking about what you guys are interested in the ADA, let us know and we'll have that conversation. There are 3 future sessions that we're also going to host. One of them is going to be specifically dedicated just to ADA coordinators. So if you have an ADA coordinator in your community or someone who's serving that role, feel free to have them come to that session. That's going to be 3-4 hours just dedicated to the job and life of an ADA coordinator. We're also going to have 2 sessions in April that are going to be solely focused on sidewalks and curb ramps. The self-evaluation side of sidewalks and curb ramps, and then the ADA transition plan side of sidewalks and curb ramps. So with that, I'll hand it over to our main speaker today, Robin Jones.
Hello, everybody. I guess I need to make sure I talk in here. Hello, everybody, and I know it's kind of weird because of this screen here, so I'll hope to maybe shift over a little bit and, so that everyone can get advantage of maybe see me or not see me. My name is Robin Jones, and I am the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center. And you have some propaganda on your desk that I have left for you. We are a federally funded technical assistance center on the Americans with Disabilities Act. We were established in 1991. We are not involved in enforcement. We are strictly involved in technical assistance and guidance and training. So we help people try to understand what they need to do. We play through things with people, architectural issues, employment issues, Title II programmatic issues, et cetera. Really the ADA from A to Z. That's our goal and our mission. And you're free to contact us at any time, and I have left plenty of things to give you, our 800 number, our website, and other information that would assist you with that. So a couple other housekeeping things that I think that we want to make sure is the bathroom's right outside the door to the right. If you need them, again, feel free to get up and use them at any time. The other thing, if you're using a computer or a handheld device and you would like to know what the password is for the internet, it is Frankfort Guest. It's the that ID you're using, and it's Frankfurt lowercase all the way, if you want to hook into the internet today. So just a little housekeeping thing that we forgot there. Our goals today are to cover the history of the ADA, just to give you some perspective on the ADA, if you're not familiar with where it came from and where we are and how we got to where we are today. The accessibility, both positive and some of the negative issues, but also we want to make sure that we emphasize the positive aspects of that. Your requirements and your liabilities under the ADA. The impact of Title II of the ADA on your facilities, policies, and procedures, as well as on local transportation and other practices of accessibility. As I already said, I am the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center. We're housed at the University of Illinois at Chicago, on the what used to be known as the Circle campus. As I said, we cover the states of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. So we're part of a network of 10 centers across the country that cover different geographic areas. All right, I'm going to start here with just the history of disability rights in general. So when we think about it, if Congress, and some of the craziness that we have in the legislature these days, we don't know what is going to be there tomorrow as far as a law or regulation. Well, let's say Congress said tomorrow, let's repeal this thing known as the Americans with Disabilities Act. It really wouldn't make that much of a significant difference for you as local municipalities, because you've had these same obligations since 1973 with the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the specific section of Section 504, which is anyone who receives federal dollars. It does not matter how much federal dollars you get, $1 federal dollar, and you have these obligations under Section 504. So the ADA was somewhat of a wake-up call, actually, for municipalities because they'd had these obligations since 1973. So any building that was constructed after 1973, et cetera, all should have been accessible according to the Rehabilitation Act. But we know that's not the case. As we look back and we look at the buildings and facilities and such that we have constructed over the years with the ADA, a lot more attention and kind of a lens was placed on that particular issue. But you've had these particular obligations for a long time. The Civil Rights Restoration Act, which came shortly after the passage of the ADA, where we looked at, a lot of people say, well, why wasn't disability ever included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And actually, there was a lot of discussion back in 1964 about disability. There was a lot of testimony that was given back in Congress in 1964 about adding disability. But if you think about it, I was just a young kid then, not that young, but I was young. I didn't know what was going on particularly, but things were very different in the world in regards to how we saw things. And even in the disability world, it was very segregated. It was very siloed. People who were deaf were over here. People who had spinal cord injury were over here. Somebody had cerebral palsy, they had a group, an organization over here. And so there wasn't really a collective voice. They all kind of came and talked on their own, but they really didn't talk about the similarities and the things that really brought them together and would really have given us much stronger voice. And also there was just a lack of awareness and understanding in the legislature and a fear of cost associated with passage of the Civil Rights, adding disability to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it came and went. But that really was a galvanizing point for the disability community, and that they really saw what had happened in the civil rights movement and how civil disobedience and things of that nature had really moved things forward and such. And so as the years went on in the late 60s and such, the disability community really started to galvanize and started to organize themselves and say, hey, we need to organize and get ourselves into legislation and get to looking at those things. And so the Americans with Disabilities Act then came along in 1990. But there was a lot of things that happened in between there. Again, the passage of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973. At the federal level, there was the passage of the Architectural Barriers Act in 1968, which applied accessibility standards to all federal buildings. Now, that would have been great if they actually complied with them, because we could probably all talk about how many post offices are not accessible and some other things that, so yes, the federal government's as guilty as anybody else passing a law and not necessarily always complying with it, but that was an important piece of legislation. As we move through, we had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that was passed, and that piece of legislation impacted individuals with disabilities in education and required free, appropriate public education for children with disabilities. Some of you may have children with disabilities who are actually beneficiaries of that, or you yourselves may have been beneficiaries of that piece of legislation. Then we had the Air Carrier Access Act passed in 1986, So that was where the airline suddenly had coverage and responsibilities, where they had to make sure that they served customers with disabilities. And so that's where we saw access onto the plane. We still don't have seating in the planes yet that are accessible. We don't have bathrooms on planes that are accessible. But we're moving more and more towards that, with more and more changes being implemented and more research being done in that area. Then in 1988, the Fair Housing Amendments Act was passed, and that addressed any housing, both from the new construction of any units of 4 or more, having to be built and constructed so that they were adaptable, so that if someone who wanted to live in a building could move into it and make it accessible. It would already have wider doors, it would already have clear floor space in the kitchen, it would already have clear floor space in the bathroom, the walls would be reinforced for being able to add grab bars and things of that nature. So that was a key piece of legislation. Also, it had a non-discriminatory component to it for denial of rental or allowing people to have emotional support animals or service animals, even if you had a no pet policy, allowing people to make changes in their unit if they needed to for accessibility at their cost, not at the cost of the landlord, but allowing them or requiring you to allow them to make those changes that they might need. And then along came the ADA in 1990. And now we've had legislation since the ADA has passed addressing things like electronic accessibility, telecommunication accessibility, etc. And I'm sure we will continue to see other pieces of legislation that will continue to evolve as society evolves. I'm going to just play a little bit of a video here that just gives you kind of a concept of some messages of people with disabilities at the time of the passage, so that you really get a better understanding of really where we were at that time and what was happening with the ADA and its passage. So we'll just let it pop up.
Over the years, experience has taught us that we must be constantly aware of people's attempts to discriminate against us. We must be prepared at every moment to fight this discrimination. The average American is not, nor should they have to be prepared to fight every day of their life for basic civil rights. All too many incidences of discrimination have gone by undefended because of lack of protection under the law. In the past, disability has been a cause for shame. This forced acceptance of second-class citizenship has stripped us as disabled people of pride and dignity. This is not the way we as Americans should have to live our lives. When I was 5, my mother proudly pushed my wheelchair to our local public school, where I was promptly refused admission because the principal ruled that I was, quote, a fire hazard, end quote. I was forced to go on to home instruction, receiving 1 hour of education twice a week for 3.5 years. Was this the America of my parents' dreams? My entrance into mainstream society was blocked by discrimination and segregation. Segregation was not only on an institutional level, but also acted as an obstruction to social integration. As a teenager, I could not travel with my friends on the bus because it was not accessible. At my graduation from high school, the principal attempted to prevent me from accepting an award in a ceremony on stage simply because I was in a wheelchair. When I was 19, the house mother of my college dormitory refused me admission into the dorm because I was in a wheelchair and needed assistance. When I was 21 years old, I was denied an elementary school teaching credential because of, quote, paralysis of both lower extremities, sequelae of poliomyelitis, end quote. At the time, I didn't know what sequelae meant. I went to the dictionary and looked it up and found out that it was because of. So it was obviously because of my disability that I was discriminated against. At the age of 25, I was told to leave a plane on my return trip to my job here in the U.S. Senate because I was flying without an attendant. In 1981, an attempt was made to forcibly remove me and another disabled friend from an auction house because we were, quote, disgusting to look at, end quote. In 1983, a manager at a movie theater attempted to keep my disabled friend and myself out of his theater because we could not transfer out of our wheelchairs. These are only a few examples of discrimination I have faced in my 4-year life. I successfully fought all of these attempted acts. aggressive confrontation or litigation. But this stigma scars for life. Many disabled persons experience discrimination of the same magnitude, but not every one of us possesses the intestinal fortitude and has the support of family and friends required to face up to these daily societal barriers. Sadly, these are not isolated examples, true only in the past tense. This is an ongoing social phenomenon which haunts our lives at every minute. I have been told throughout my life the understanding of these people's actions, quote, they don't know any better, end quote. Neither I nor any one of the 42 million other people with disabilities can wait for the 200 million non-disabled Americans to become educated to the fact that disability does not negate our entitlement to the same constitutional rights as other civil rights legislation has made previously sanctioned discrimination illegal. So too will the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1988 outlaw protectivist, paternalistic, ignorant discrimination against all persons with disabilities. We as disabled persons are here today to ensure for the class of disabled Americans the ordinary daily life that non-disabled Americans too often take for granted. The right to ride a bus or a train, the right to any job for which we are qualified, the right to enter any theater, restaurant, or public accommodation, the right to purchase a home or rent an apartment, the right to appropriate communication. Whether you have HIV infection, cancer, heart disease, back problems, epilepsy, diabetes, polio, muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, are deaf or blind, discrimination affects input. We are here today to say that people in our society have been raised with prejudicial attitudes that have resulted in extreme discrimination against the 42 million persons with disabilities in the United States. Discrimination.
So you get the picture. So you heard her say 1988, and we know that the ADA was passed in 1990. This is because this was the first year that it was introduced, and the hope was that it would be passed in 1988. But of course, with most legislation, it fails. Whoops.
Over the years,
It fails the first time, second time, third time, and it took a couple of years for that piece of legislation to pass. But I hope you got the message from, this was Judy Heumann, who is a renowned social justice person in the disability community, who has really been an instrumental leader nationally and internationally, and was instrumental in a lot of the passage of the ADA, giving her comments before Congress, because many within Congress had not heard this before, had not been part of this. And we have to think about the times and such of that nature. But I can tell you, I still hear people today that will tell me that they don't feel that people with disabilities should be given the same rights, that they should not be paid the same, that they should not be doing whatever. So I think it's just a reminder to us that this discrimination has been longstanding and pervasive, and unfortunately still today prevails today. And one of the things that we're here today to do is make sure that your communities do not feed into that your communities are moving forward and ensuring that your citizens in your communities have full equal access to everything that everyone else does with or without a disability. So how do we get where we are now? You've heard some of her testimony about what things were like and what was the purpose of the ADA. We've gotten there because we do education. We're trying to make sure that people know about their rights and responsibilities. We have 3 generations of individuals now born since the ADA's passage. So that this is a group of people who are now in their 30s who have never not known the rights and such of that nature. And then you have that group of people who were born before that who struggled for their rights. So it's really been interesting to watch how that has evolved over time, and that group of individuals who've always had rights and are going to demand rights, and they're going to be the ones who are not going to tolerate you saying, well, we'll get to it next year when the budget allows us to, et cetera. They're going to say, you've had 32 years, 33 years to be able to do these things. So, you really need to be mindful of that particular issue. Advocacy. There's definitely a healthy tension between advocating for something and wanting to be a member of the society and to fit in and such of that nature. And so there's always been that kind of healthy tension between that issue of educating and advocating, and then where people have had to at some times go as far as to have to file complaints or go into the courts. As I said, that's where the enforcement comes in, through complaints, through lawsuits and things of that nature, is in a large part why we are in some ways where we are today. I'm going to just talk for a minute about the definition of disability. There's often a lot of confusion about who is a person with a disability. There are a million different definitions of disability depending on the context of which we're having the conversation. So for many of us that may be employed, we have a short-term or long-term disability policy that our employer carries on us. If we may become sick or injured on the job or during while we're working, and we would get a payment. That is an insurance definition of disability. Looks at your ability to work or continue to be able to work and pays a payment based on that particular definition that that insurance policy is using, defining what you're eligible. It could be they can't work for 30 days, 60 days, or whatever. You suddenly would become eligible for that. You have the parking eligibility for a parking placard or your license plate designation as having a disability. Believe it or not, the ADA has nothing whatsoever to do with a parking placard or a license plate. The only thing the ADA has to do with is a parking space in regards to how many you have and what they look like. Who parks in them has nothing whatsoever to do with the ADA. That is driven by state law or local codes that determine who's eligible to park in those particular spaces, who's eligible for that hang tag, who's eligible for that license plate designation, etc. So every state might be a little bit different. You have states that have different designations, like the state of Michigan has a designation for people who have who can get exempted from meters versus people who can't get exempted from meters but can park in the space. They have a designation in regards to people who have hand function or other issues that might preclude them from plugging a meter, etc. So they would be exempt from being able to plug the meter. But they have other designations that say, no, you're able to park in the space, but you still have to plug the meter. So you get the wider space, or you get the wider area, etc. Illinois doesn't have that same specific type of designation differentiation. But again, it's driven by state law. It's not driven by the ADA. Again, the ADA drives what the space looks like and how many you have to have and where they have to be. But that is all that the ADA has to do with that definition of disability. Social Security has its own definition of disability, where you may become eligible for Social Security after you've paid into Social Security and you may become disabled and no longer able to work. It's based on the predication of able to sustain gainful employment. We know there are a lot of people with disabilities who do not qualify for Social Security disability because they're able to work. Because I have to be able to demonstrate or prove that I'm unable to work due to my disability. So it's not an automatic, oh, you have a disability, go ahead and apply for SSDI, you'll qualify. That's not going to be the case. It's got its own definition of disability. So it's really important to understand that while we use the term disability, it's got a million different definitions depending on the context of which we're using it. In the context of the ADA, there is a three-pronged definition of disability for individuals who are covered or protected under the ADA. The first prong of the definition are those who have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits them in one or more major life activities. These are individuals who actually have an impairment that limits them in one or more major life activities, psychological impairment or physical impairment, which could include sensory, learning, and other kinds of issues as well. This is an individual who has a impairment that is, as we look at the definition, that would be defined as which is greater, their limitation is greater than what is found in the general population. It doesn't mean I have to be unable to do something. It doesn't have to be that I'm so severely limited that I can't do something. That's the only time I'm going to have coverage. It doesn't have to be permanent or long-term in order to be covered under the ADA. It just has to be a limitation that's greater than what would be found in the general population. So if I was to, all of us were today, go out to walk a mile, there's some of us that are going to have difficulty walking that mile because maybe arthritis issues or lung impairments or other kinds of things. So we would expect a healthy 30-year-old individual to be able to walk a mile, but there's some of us that would not be able to do that. That may mean that we could be a person with a disability. So again, you have to look at that. It's a very broad definition. It's a very broad catchment. It includes people with episodic conditions. They don't have to be present all the time, or the limitation doesn't have to be present all the time. Seizure disorders, things of that nature. They may not have that all the time. It also includes bodily functions. So I may not look like I have a disability, but I have diabetes, and I have something wrong with my endocrine system. I have stage 4 or 5 kidney disease. I have something wrong with my kidneys, etc. So my bodily functions are limited. I don't necessarily have, I can still walk, I can still talk, but I might have other limitations. when we really start to hone down and looking at this issue, and it gets more critical in definition, when we start to look at, is this person eligible for a reasonable accommodation, is employment. Because I may have a disability, and I'm covered for discrimination under the ADA, but whether I'm eligible for a reasonable accommodation, there has to be a nexus between my limitation and the requested accommodation that is being made. So just because I have a disability does not automatically make me eligible for a reasonable accommodation. There has to be a limitation that is tied to what I'm requesting as a reasonable accommodation. Okay. Second prong of the definition of disability are individuals who are covered who have a history of having such an impairment. So these are individuals who may have had a disability in the past, had cancer, addiction, etc. No longer is it current for them, but they may face discrimination based on that past history. They go to apply for a job, somebody looks at their job history and says, hey, I don't want to hire you, you're a risk, you've had cancer in the past, you're going to, increase my insurance, or you have a drug history, you have an alcohol history, you're going to potentially start to drink or use again, etc. I don't want to hire somebody like that. I'm protected against discrimination based on that past history. The third prong of the definition are individuals who are regarded as having a disability. Now, this could be somebody with or without a disability where a negative action is taken against them because somebody made an assumption about that person, about them potentially being limited or having a disability. So let's say I am a person with disability who uses a wheelchair and for mobility and things of that nature, but I go into, let's say, an employer as an example, and the job may require that you have some job tasks that have to be carried out where you have to stand for short times, or you have to lift things and reach things at high places or whatever. That person sees me in a wheelchair and automatically says, you're not qualified for this job. So they have no idea whether I can get up or not, that I can stand or not. They're making an assumption about me because I'm sitting in that wheelchair. That would be regarding me as a person with a disability. It's taking a negative action against me. You don't actually know that I can't do it. You never explored whether I could do it or couldn't do it. You made an assumption about me. Obesity has not been found to be a disability under the ADA. There's few courts. It's a very controversial issue in the courts, but obesity by itself has not been ruled to necessarily be a disability. There might be an underlying medical condition that causes the obesity that would be a disability. Well, the obesity itself is not. But we know that people who are obese are often stereotyped, negatively biased, etc., in how people react and treat them, etc. We've all seen those 60 minutes and 48-hour shows where you take two people who are exactly the same credential, one's obese and one is not, send them in to apply for a job. Who got the job? The person who wasn't obese, okay? We know that those biases exist. That would be another area of regarded as. I'm regarding you as being unable to do something, and I would have protection in the law. This is an area that's really expanding in the law area because it is a slippery slope for employers and others to make assumptions about individuals based on what they see or they think about that individual. So that's the three-pronged definition of disability under the ADA. All of those individuals have protections for non-discrimination. Whether or not there is eligibility for an accommodation, so you as a municipality having to accommodate somebody for sign language or for real-time captioning or for a special chair in a meeting or something of that nature, it has to be linked to them actually having the limitation and having the disability before you had the responsibility to accommodate them. Just coming and saying, I have a disability, you need to give me that chair. That's not going to be sufficient because there's not an automatic nexus between those two things. I have to have the limitation that necessitates that accommodation. Make sense? So it's really important to understand this. The other group that is covered that we often don't talk about are individuals who are associated with persons with disabilities. Oftentimes, families and others, significant others, are discriminated against because of their association with people with disabilities. If I want to go to a store or a restaurant and that restaurant is not accessible, or that store is not accessible, and I have family members with me who have disabilities, we're all denied access to go to that because I can't enjoy that environment with my family member who has to have a disability. I've been discriminated against even though I don't have a disability because I can't enjoy the activity the same as with my family member, etc. So association with a person with a disability is also a covered area under the ADA. Just to give you a sense of the demographics of disability and who we're really talking about 16% of people with disabilities use mobility devices, crutches, canes, things of that nature. This is the group we often think about as having a disability because they're the most visible, They're also the group that is accessible doors and elevators and things of that nature. But it's not the largest group of people with disabilities. About 49% of people with disabilities have either vision or hearing impairment, and this number increases substantially as you get older. I didn't wear these glasses at 39. Okay, 48, got glasses. Every year thereafter, that prescription gets a little bit stronger. Okay? Hearing, it's really interesting to see some of the statistics on hearing and how we're seeing hearing loss at a much younger age than we used to, largely because of the earbuds that we're now using, and so much of the sound that we're pumping directly into our ears versus ambient sound in the background, like when I grew up and we would play our speakers too loud and my dad would yell at us. That wasn't going directly into my ears the way it is now with the earbuds and things of that nature. So those statistics are changing somewhat. 33% of people with disabilities have a major medical health condition, diabetes, heart disease, HIV, seizure disorder, mental illness would also fit into this area. Actually, the statistics are showing that mental illness is the most underdiagnosed condition in the United States, that up to a third of the population of the United States has some form of mental illness. But that we don't do a good job of identifying it in the medical system, and also the stigmas associated with it, people coming forward with identifying that they have some form of mental illness. Learning disability, Alzheimer's, and head injury comes for about 18%. And then, as I said, the population of having mental disorder and such. Point is, if you think about the ones I just talked about, hearing, diabetes, learning disability, mental illness, they're all invisible. So keep in mind that the majority of disability is invisible. You don't see it. So don't only focus on that physical disability related issues. Remember, you have people who don't have disabilities, and they're going to be asking for other kinds of accommodations and things. And as we talk today, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Language of disability has become an ever-evolving issue. How we talk about disability. So we're all familiar with the fact that, as a society, we've become very focused on making sure we're all politically correct, that we're using the right terminologies, and it's evolved. In different communities, it's evolved. For example, the Spanish-speaking community, the Latino community, now the terminology that is being used widely in the Latin community is Latinx. No longer using Latina or Latino, but using Latinx. That is somewhat accepted by the older generation of the Latin community, but mostly by the younger generation. It's being driven by them and not wanting to be defined by those pronouns of the Latino and Latina to designate male and female, etc. So Latinx has become a very new terminology to use, or the emerging terminology. Same with disability, it's evolved. We spent a lot of time talking about people-first language, which is where you put the person first and disability second. You don't focus on my disability. So when you're describing me, you're talking about me. You're talking about me, not about my disability. So you're saying that the man with spinal cord injury, not that spinal cord injured person, kind of a thing. But that's evolved. And so now we have a whole sector of the disability community, especially the younger generation of the disability community, who's really embracing the disability identity and is switching from the people-first language to identity-first language, where the disability comes first, where they're recognizing and they're centering on the disability. So a disabled person or disabled people being the phraseology. So it's really important to understand that language is an important component of understanding and recognizing and acknowledging that you understand the disability community and that you work with and are working with that community and not against that community. And so you look at, well, what should I say? Or how should I write it then? What should I be using? What's the appropriate language to use, knowing that there's this tension between people first and identity first. The rule of thumb is just to really acknowledge that everybody's different and they have their own preferences. So you may or may not use the right terminology, and just acknowledge that. Just make sure that you're aware of what you are using. Not one size does fit all for every group, population, etc. Some people within the disability community prefer one term over the other. So, blind or low vision, autism, deaf and hard of hearing, all of those groups have their own preferences in regards to how they want to be referred to. The rule of thumb is ask. If it's a known audience to you, that you know a group that you're working with, ask them what they prefer. So your communities and stuff, ask what how you would like us to reference you and to use language in our policies and things of that nature. You have this group, you have a collective group of things. If you don't know the audience, then default to people first, that's the safest to default back to. But just acknowledge the fact that language is different and not everybody is going to like or want or prefer the way that you are using your language. So ask and engage with the community about that discussion, about how do you want to be referred to and how should we refer to you. Just understand language is a really important component of everything that you do. All right. Any questions about those kinds of things before we move forward? All right, going to go forward. So under Title II of the ADA, there's this whole host, five administrative requirements that were set forth in the ADA that all municipalities are required to deal with or to make sure that they have done. So one is designating a responsible employee. You heard Travis talk about the fact that the next training that is going to be held is going to be solely focused on this ADA coordinator. Now, that is a terminology that does not exist in the ADA. That is a terminology that has evolved through the ADA's implementation. The ADA does not actually use the terminology of ADA coordinator. It just says designated employee. ADA coordinator has been a terminology that kind of evolved from 504 because people used 504 coordinators under 504 language, and so it kind of evolved into, okay, ADA coordinator. But we've used and seen a whole host of different terminologies used to designate this particular position, compliance, or all kinds of things. It's really up to you. It's really the critical thing is to make sure that you have that responsible employee. And you've designated that person who has sufficient authority to make decisions and act on behalf of the entity. Do not assign it to a secretary who has no authority whatsoever, but they push papers. This person has to be able to make decisions, has to be able to act on behalf of your institution because they are the point person to the public related to disability and ADA related issues for your municipality. Second is a grievance procedure. Now, many entities already have a grievance procedure. The ADA doesn't say you have to have a separate or new grievance procedure. The ADA just says that you have to have a grievance procedure available to people in order to resolve issues internally without having to escalate it to a formal complaint to like DOJ or a federal agency or anything of that nature. It also requires that you publicize that procedure and make it known to people that it can be used for that purpose. An Illinois requirement. This is not in the ADA. Illinois passed a law that says specifically that a municipality that has a website must post the name, office, address, telephone number of the ADA coordinator, and if any grievance procedures, if adopted by the municipality, to resolve ADA complaints. This is an Illinois state statute. So this is not the ADA telling you you have to publish it on your website. This is the state of Illinois statutorily telling you you have to do this. Again, it's only triggered if you have a website. Anyone here not have a website? Okay, so all of you. So if I was to now go to all of your municipalities and go to your websites, would I find an ADA coordinator? Would I find on anybody's? A couple of you have seen nods here. Okay, some of you do have it, and it's on your website. Hopefully, yes.
So doesn't it say if any ADA coordinator?
Well, if any adopted, no, a grievance procedures, if any, adopted by.
No, the first of it, ADA coordinator, comma, if any.
If any, yes, correct.
You don't have an ADA coordinator.
Right, if you don't have an ADA coordinator, because again, this is state law telling you that if you have one, you have to publish it. The ADA is telling you you have to have one.
Yeah.
Okay? So the Illinois did not mandate you to have an ADA coordinator. Illinois law mandates you, if you have one, you have to publish it. The ADA is telling you you have to have it. So again, two different laws. Yeah, the legislature, I was part of this back when this was done in the late 90s. The legislature obviously could not mandate you to have, or didn't want to go there, mandating you to have these things because, of course, it was a federal law, not a state law. But they did feel that they had the authority to mandate that you promote it if you did have it. And that was really what the disability committee was going for, was making sure you could find it. This is and you probably are not able to see this with a small screen up here, but you will be able to see it in the handouts when you receive them. This is a sample grievance procedure, and we give you a link here to where this is found online. So it gives you an idea of what one would look like or how you might fashion it. Again, if you already have a grievance procedure in your community for citizens to be able to raise issues with your municipality, it may be just tweaking that particular grievance procedure to meet these needs. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to create a whole new grievance procedure. The issue is you need to have one that somebody can use for ADA-related purposes, basically. Now, the role of an ADA coordinator is really a delicate balance. You know, it's this issue of being the compliance, you know, the CYA for the community, make sure that everything's in order, that we're not getting in trouble, that we're doing it, all our ducks are lined up, etc. But also we're an advocate for our citizens with disabilities. We want to make sure that they get equal access to things of nature. So sometimes there's a tension there, right? Because especially when it comes down to something that might cost something, and now I'm asking for money, or, you know, or there's need to spend expenditures, etc. But there's this inequity. You know, there's things that are inaccessible. There's curb cuts that don't exist. Somebody can't travel down the road. I'm advocating for those things to be fixed, but I know that there's this cost here at the same time. You know, so I have the interest of the organization, but I'm also wanting to make sure that the organization doesn't end up in the courts, you know, or doesn't end up with a complaint being filed or whatever. So it's really a delicate balance in that particular position. It's not an easy position for somebody to be in, to respond to the public at the same time, having to be accountable, you know, to budget and other kinds of things, but also making sure that the entity is not liable at the same time. The third obligation under the ADA administrative requirements is a notice to the public. This is a public statement across multiple platforms, whether it's print, auditory, website, etc., that tells the public that you are compliant with the ADA, and this is how you address any issues if you feel that you have been discriminated against. So this is partly announcing, you know, who to contact if you need to contact, but also affirmatively stating that we are in compliance and we, you know, meet our obligations under the ADA. The fourth obligation is to conduct a self-evaluation. This is an assessment of all your programs, services, and activities to identify where any barriers exist that may preclude people with disabilities from participating. And this is required from all entities regardless of your size. So the smallest municipality to the largest municipality needs to have a Title II self-evaluation document. This is a sample. This is from Crystal Lake of their notice, but it just gives you an idea. Again, too small for you to see on this little tiny screen, but we do provide a hyperlink to it. I chose this one because it's a very well-written one. I don't know, you know, if anybody here knows anybody from Crystal Lake, but bravo to them. They did a nice job with their notice to the public. It's right on their website. It's very easy to find. It's very clear and concise, etc. It contains all the right information, etc. So this is just an example for you to look at that we would consider to be a best practice. What also they have nice on their website, on the same place where they have their notice, is you'll see over to the side, if you look at it closer, is where they have contact us. They have their ADA coordinators, contact information, etc. And they also have links to the grievance procedure. And because they've completed their transition plan, they have a link for people from the public to be able to go to see the transition plan if they want to expose. So it's very transparent. It's very open to everybody in the community for if they're looking for information. They don't have to hunt it down. They don't have to do a lot of search Googles and things to find it. It's readily right there. Title II, fifth obligation is the development of a transition plan. Now this is only for municipalities of 50 or more employees, so small municipalities are not required to go through this particular step. And this is a step to identify the physical barriers that impact your programs, services, and activities, and identify how those barriers will be removed. what kind of a time frame, et cetera. Now, this was a requirement that was originally in the ADA when it was first passed in 1990, and the obligation to do so was basically ended in 1995 because you were supposed to have completed that process. So many people would say, well, okay, well that date came and went, that's gone, so I don't have to worry about it. And that's true, that the date has come and gone. What this is at today's world is that we know that there are still barriers. We still know that municipalities have things that are still barriers. They still have physical barriers. The transition plan is a good faith effort way to identify and acknowledge we have these barriers, but this is our plan to remove those barriers. Here's what we have laid out in the next 5 years, 10 years or whatever, that we're going to remove these particular barriers. So we're demonstrating that we acknowledge we have barriers, and we acknowledge then that we have a plan in place that we're going to remove those barriers. So this is something that if an individual is filing a complaint and an attorney potentially is going to come in and do any kind of discovery, one of the first things they're going to ask is, do you have a transition plan? Because you have a barrier. So do you have a transition plan that acknowledges that barrier and that has any kind of a plan for removing that barrier? What are your alternatives while it's being done? So this building isn't accessible, that it's housing certain programs and activities, and your transition plan demonstrates that you in the next 5 years are going to be making that building accessible. In the meantime, you've moved the programs that are open to the public over to this building over here that is accessible. So that's, we've demonstrated how, yes, we acknowledge we have a building that's accessible, but our program is accessible. That's a critical component. That is part of this process. That's what you're doing in this process. We're going to talk much more in detail as we go here about this process.
So we have to talk about it, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the potential liabilities. There are liabilities when it comes to non-compliance. The big one is anytime lawyers come in and say, how's your community doing? At that point, they are going to look at everything. They're going to open you up. They're going to see where you're at. A lot of times these lawsuits start with, there was one public bathroom that wasn't accessible. But once they get in, they say, well, let's look at every single one of your public bathrooms. And then now you have 20, 40, 100 public bathrooms that aren't accessible. So that's where this ADA transition plan is so important, because it's that ability to sort of show that good faith effort. To show that you can't do everything today, but you have a plan to make it better in the future. Bad press. Bad press is always a possibility. These stories tend to make good newspaper headlines. So you're bringing the press in, negative look for the community. Project Civic Access, we're going to talk about this in a couple slides, but it is a Department of Justice program in which they come into your community and they look at everything. Department of Justice comes in, and this is where that personal responsible charge is so important, because whenever they come in, they're going to say, okay, let me talk to your ADA coordinator, your accessibility coordinator, whoever. And if that person doesn't know that that's their title, that's not a great start to your Department of Justice experience. If they walk in and say, okay, your ADA coordinator is the secretary, and she's like, nobody ever told me I was the ADA coordinator, that's not how you want to start your life with the Department of Justice. Subject to private lawsuits and settlement agreements. There's examples out there, they're very easy to find. You do some Google searches, you'll come across it. And really, the success comes if you haven't started the process. Like Robin was talking about with the good faith effort. If someone walks in and you say, I have nothing, I can't show you anything. That process is a lot different than saying, we've started, we just can't get to everything in our city right now. We have a budget, we're prioritizing what we're prioritizing. This is why we're prioritizing it. And we're going to get there eventually, but we're not there yet. That's a very different conversation than, I've never heard of the ADA. What's the ADA? The most important thing to remember here is someone else can take control of your financial obligations. If you get a settlement agreement, that can include you're going to spend X number of your budget improving the ADA. So now you've lost control of your budget. Somebody else is dictating what your future budget looks like, how you're going to allocate the time, how you're going to allocate your people. And really, that's sort of one of the things here. It's obviously we're trying to improve the community, but what we're also trying to do is allow the communities to improve themselves and not somebody else tell them how they're going to improve the community. Project Civic Access, it is a Department of Justice program. There's been 7 of them that have happened in the state of Illinois. Very detailed, you can go through, read about what the process is. They're all a little bit different. In some cases, it includes you're going to do this, this, and this. In other cases, it's a list 3 miles long. So we're going to have an example later of a Project Civic Access case and sort of how that process went. But they're really, if you're interested about what it looks like when the Department of Justice shows up, Project Civic Access is a really good look into that. We just talked about liabilities, but we need to talk about the positive side of accessibility. There are an increasing number of individuals with disabilities. 43 million in 1990, 58 million in 2020. As Robin was saying earlier, we know that number is low. That's an estimate. That number is almost guaranteed to be lower than what it actually is. We're an aging society. 15% of the population in suburban Cook County is 65 years or older. With aging comes not only disability, but just more sensitivity to access. We've moved to the virtual world, and accessibility is moving to the virtual world as well. As we've moved into online meetings, virtual, people are, they can do things virtually. Accessibility applies in that world too. Whenever you host public meetings now, Zoom, other places, they have closed captioning you can use. They have transcripts. There's resources out there, but it's important that you guys are using those resources. Because just because you guys are doing a virtual meeting now, doesn't mean that accessibility doesn't apply to that virtual meeting. Lastly, it really benefits the entire community. We looked around, we haven't found stats on proof of sort of numbers-wise like what it does, but an accessible sidewalk is for everybody. It's the mothers in the wheelchair, it's the runners, it's roller bags, all that stuff. It makes for a visually appealing community, which I assume helps property values. I can't give you statistics on this, but it makes sense when you think about it. If you have an accessible community, you're a community that's open to everybody. So I think we spend a lot of time with accessibility, talking about the people that are disabled, and I think that's really important. But at the end of the day, if you're accessible to someone with a disability, you're accessible to everybody else in your community. And that's really sort of our goal here, is that every community, resident and citizen, can access all those programs and services. Just some sort of general pictures of, sign language interpreters for meetings. If someone calls or requests a sign language interpreter, does your community know what to do? Voting, that's going to be a big one. Crosswalks, and really, as Robin talked about earlier, it's not just wheelchairs. Our first thought is always wheelchairs, canes, things of that nature, but it's that broad disability, and we're going to spend the next couple hours talking about what that means. But really, that's sort of where we're going next. It's if we can provide access for everybody, we're much more engaged and a much more open community for the residents.
So as Travis said, I'm going to give you some discussion, a little bit of case study of the Project Civic Access. I have one out of Chicago, out of Illinois, example of one in Illinois. First one is the city of Milwaukee. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just over the border, the Brewers, et cetera, and the Bucks. This was a settlement agreement in 2016 where the U.S. Department of Justice had a complaint from somebody in the community that started out with the Riverwalk. Now, I don't know if anybody's been to Milwaukee, but Milwaukee, like Chicago, has water. And in this case, they have both a lake, but they also have a river, similar to we do that developed the river. And there was accessibility issues with the Riverwalk. And a complaint was filed with the Department of Justice related to that issue. As they came into the city of Milwaukee, looking at the Riverwalk, they expanded that greatly to look at basically everything and anything that the city of Milwaukee was doing as it related to the ADA. And so what they found in that settlement agreement when they came and looked was that they had a lack of any person with authority to act on accessibility issues. They had no or a lack of inventory of any barriers or anything that was constructed prior to 1992. They found that there were buildings that were newly constructed since 1990 when the ADA went into effect and the 91 standards that were not accessible. That they had a lack of policies and procedures for communication, and they had a lack of inclusion with disabilities in any of their emergency planning and shelter information and programs and services. That there were numerous public rights-of-way without curb cuts in the commercial and residential areas. They lacked a policy for police department to transport and detain individuals with disabilities, and a lack of accessible voting locations, policies, and procedures for accessible voting as well. So you can see that what started out with a complaint against the Riverwalk went into, wow, every aspect from police to voting to communication to our sidewalks, etc. So it became a very comprehensive review of that municipality. The outcome of that particular settlement agreement was a 5-year monitoring process, which actually got extended because they did not complete it. But they were required and mandated to inventory all public rights of way and to develop a plan of removal of barriers at intersections, et cetera, within 3 years. Develop a citywide policy for effective communication. Inventory all polling locations within 3 years. Revamp the city's website within 3 years. So that's a pretty aggressive process. And the city did not meet the 5-year requirements. They didn't meet the 3-year, they didn't meet the 5-year. They actually extended into a 10-year of monitoring by the Department of Justice because of the things that they found and they didn't do and dragged on at that point. They're actually fearful of another review at the present time because they've experienced some ongoing issues. This one is from Champaign County here in Illinois. Now this is the county of Champaign, not the city of Champaign, that was subject to a quasi-civic access settlement in 2015. In this particular situation, the complaint was filed. The Department of Justice was responding initially to a complaint related to some issues of access to some services, some county-provided services not being accessible, some lack of sign language interpreters and things of that nature in regards to the services. When they came in and did their review and started their review, they did found that the community had started in self-evaluation in 1992, but it was not comprehensive, and they took little action on the thing. So what they said is, great, you started it, you were doing what you were supposed to do, but yet you didn't act on it. So you get brownie points for starting something in 1992, but you get a strike for not doing anything with that. They appointed an ADA coordinator in 1992, but the position was vacant. Nobody was in the position. So again, they did what they were supposed to do, but they did maintain it, and they didn't do it. There hadn't been anybody specifically assigned since 1995. So that's a pretty long time from 1995 to 2015 of having nobody in that particular position. They had conducted a limited architectural review of their facilities in 92, and the barriers were identified, but they did not complete their plan or remove the barriers that were identified in the plan. They had a lack of policies and procedures for effective communication. They had no notice to the public of their compliance. They had no grievance procedure for the citizens, and they had a lack of policies and procedures for law enforcement regarding persons with disabilities. They also lacked emergency management procedures. They lacked accessible polling places. They lacked an inventory for sidewalks, crosswalks, curb cuts. Their website was inaccessible to people with disabilities, and they did not have, they had a lot of third-party programs and things that they were using that also were not accessible. So this idea of the fact that, well, it's not my responsibility because a third party is doing it. No, if it's doing it on your behalf, it is your responsibility to whatever that third party is doing. The outcome of their particular settlement agreement was, again, a 5-year monitoring process. They were required to name somebody to make sufficient decisions, and also to establish an interagency coordinating committee because, again, the nature of a county and different kinds of programs and services that the county might have. They were required to hire a licensed architect to oversee the development of inventory of all buildings and operated within 3 months. Implementation remediation within 5 years. So they were mandated in this to hire somebody to do something. Not saying, well, we'll use our internal staff, we'll choose to use our own internal resources. No, you have to hire somebody externally to do this, and this is going to be a process for 5 years. They were required to develop a plan for their public rights-of-way intersections within 3 months with a removal in 3 years. Pretty aggressive plan. And develop a countywide policy for effective communication, as well as an inventory of all polling locations for accessible voting within 3 years. They were required to revamp their website to meet the World Wide Web Consortium's accessibility guidelines within 3 months. If anybody has ever taken on a website, revamping and redoing a website to be accessible is as bad as making a building accessible. It's not that you can just go in and tweak something. It's got its own structure, the same as a building has a structure. So you have to really tear it down and rebuild it back up. It's not as simple as to just go in and make a code change here or a code change there. And they were required to incorporate specific elements of Chapter 7 of the ADA Toolkit, Department of Justice Toolkit, which I'm going to talk about as one of your resources, and you have some of those in your handouts today, into their emergency management plan within 60 days. That was a pretty aggressive time frame also for them. Now, I do have to say, and I have to applaud, Champaign County did meet their obligations, and were pretty effective with doing that. They also were required to make sure that all of their voting was accessible in the next designated election, and to modify their procedures for employment, which is also interesting, in that the previous settlement agreements in the Department of Justice had not gone into employment issues. In this particular one, they actually went into employment issues. What drove them to go into employment, we don't know, but it was something you should be aware of, that it may not stop at just your services and programs. They may also delve into your employment practices and procedures as well. So at this point, we're going to take questions, if you have any related to that. Just would like you to go ahead and pull out, before we do that, the very first handout that you have in your little packet. This handout is from the Title II toolkit the Department of Justice created. And it is a checklist for you to think about, what have we done or have we not done, what do we have to do in regards to our administrative requirements. So this particular checklist goes down and it tells you specifically, these are the things that you need, and now it's going to ask you specific questions. So I'm going to start here, and I'm going to ask you to respond to me in regards to some of these questions. You can take a look at them here as you go.
You are going to respond.
Battery work? It was working before.
So I think for questions, just so we can hear it for the camera, we'll repeat any questions.
All right, so I already alluded to this before. If you look at the very first page, it asks you about the fact, do you have a ADA coordinator? How many in this room already have an ADA coordinator that you can say you know and they're designated, and you can tell me today who that person was? About half. Okay, all right. That's been the check everybody needs to be working on, okay? That's a key issue. All right. If you go down, it then asks you different questions about the ADA coordinator, because it's not just do I have a coordinator, but it also is the issue, does this person have sufficient authority? Are they actually carrying out their duties? Are they actually doing what they need to do? Do they investigate complaints? And do you make available, and I think we got to that a little bit earlier in my question, of the fact was, how many of you actually publicize who the ADA coordinator is on your website? Again, can we get a hand on that? Okay. So for those of you that do that, and I'm just curious, are you actually publicizing the person's name, or are you just providing contact information for that person? Because we see a lot of municipalities that have like a generic email that's ADA coordinator at city of .gov versus Robin Jones at such and such. What are people doing? What's the primary? Okay, go ahead.
name, email, phone number.
Okay, so
Email
back,
Specific name, email.
okay, so back, somebody say they're using specific name, email, and contact information, okay? Anybody using just more of a generic, ADA coordinator? A couple of you I've seen are identified.
Well, I'm doing a mixture of both. I've got my name on there, but I use a generic email address just so that when I have an ADA question or comment come up, it goes to that email. So it's automatically sorted away from my other duties.
That's a very efficient, and you bring up a very good point. So what he's saying is that because he holds multiple hats, and not just the ADA coordinator hat, that he separates his information out. So his email for ADA specific issues is ADA coordinator hat, so that he can keep that separate from his other roles or his emails that might come in for other things. And that's, I'm sure, very much for efficiency. Also, if you were to assign that issue to somebody else, that they could easily. Also, we find that it avoids using that kind of more generic approach. Also avoids when the position changes, having to switch all that over, kind of thing. So, anybody who's at the ADA coordinator is responsible for ADA coordinator, at whatever email address. So that's, very, we see that a lot. That's used on a pretty consistent basis. So you hear kind of different models that people are using, and it really depends. One of the things we also hear from people in a fear of putting emails and things of that nature on their websites is because of bots that are using, they're out there that send a lot of spam and stuff too, and they search for email addresses on the website, and then they send a lot of spam and stuff of that nature to that. So another way that we find that people manage it is a contact us form. Kind of a thing on the website. Instead of the actual email, they'll have a contact us form, kind of a thing that you can fill out on the website for somebody to be able to, contact you as another option as well. So, all right, good, great. I'm glad to hear that there's some of you that are moving along. So if you go through that, then the next thing that this asks you, this checklist does, do you have a statement to the public, about your accessibility, et cetera? How many of you have any kind of an affirmative statement on your website about your accessibility, about your villages or your cities' accessibility and your compliance with the ADA? How many of you have an actual, so see one at least, okay? This is something you really need to make sure that you do, that there's affirmative, and this is not just on the website, but it should be in multiple modes, because not everybody's on your website. So it should be also in paper format, in brochures, so if you have a city brochure or something of that nature, it should be there as well. So you need to make sure that you've got that, and the checklist goes through and asks you those kinds of questions. So what the purpose of these kinds of checklists are is to help you think through what have we done and what have we not done. So I really highly recommend this particular checklist to be used kind of as a starting point for those of you that are just starting to delve in and use this one from the Title II checklist is available online for you in both a PDF and a Word and an HTML format. And we have given you and will be giving you the hyperlinks of where to find that, so you don't have to worry about that. But do you think that a checklist like this would be useful to you to use tonight to come up with your own? Yeah, I know it's always, even for me, I find that even if I don't use everything on the checklist, I might like plagiarize, and grab from it what I like and create my own checklist for my departments. Do any of you that are looking at this or considering this, one of the other things that we see is that ADA coordinators, there's oftentimes not just one single ADA coordinator, that you might decentralize it type of thing. You might have an ADA coordinator in HR. You might have an ADA coordinator in facilities. And then you might have an ADA coordinator maybe in the city clerk's office or something that deals with programs, services, and activities. That's a perfectly okay model. So just wanted to say that you don't have to, and you're going to talk more about that when we have the ADA coordinator training. The issue is that there is that somebody has to be ultimately responsible at the top for decision making. So even if you have a decentralized model, there needs to be a sufficient authority that somebody is able to say yes or no. But we do see that kind of decentralized process that's used. And then, so the checklist will take you through the other administrative requirements as well. It's just, I think it's 6 pages, 5 pages, a little checklist. All right. Any questions before we take a break? Everybody's feeling okay? All right. All right, we're going to take a 10, we'll be back at 10:25.
The effects on them that do not meet Title II requirements. So it is an all-encompassing look at the city, village, municipality. That's why whenever for our case studies, they came in to look at one thing, but that's how they ended up looking at law enforcement and effective communication and things of that nature, is because the self-evaluation covers everything. So you described the areas that are examined. I looked at these areas, and then I didn't look at these areas for this reason. Mechanical rooms have a very specific requirement on them. You know, those don't get evaluated the same as the lobby of Village Hall. So what you looked at, what you found, is what the problem is, and then sort of that's also where you keep your record of sort of the modifications that are made. I always sort of think of the self-evaluation as that your running list of accomplishments. We identified all these barriers. This is how we've addressed those barriers. It's an opportunity for people to take part in this process. Community engagement is a critical part of what we do in the ADA. The disability community knows where they struggle. If you reach out to them, they're going to give you a list of the 10 places that they can't get to. They're going to tell you, I can't get to the 3rd floor of here, and that's where I have to go to get my building permit. You know, the community, your residents know where they have issues. So if you ever want to know what's wrong in your community, the residents are a great place to start. If the entity is larger than 50 employees, you have to keep this on file for 3 years. That is a requirement of the ADA. I strongly support everybody keeping it on file for 3 years, but there's a 50 threshold there. And lastly, it's an action plan. We don't do this self-evaluation so that we know about all our problems and then not do anything about those problems. As we kind of saw with our Champaign example, they started the process. What the Department of Justice needed them to do and what they're making them do now is finishing the process. So it's not just starting it, it's what is the community going to do in the future? So the big question is, what is a program, service, or activity? To give you guys a general definition, it is a service or activity with a single purpose. It is an activity undertaken by a department that affords benefits, information, opportunities, or activities to one or more members of the public. So I just want to take a second here of sort of, if we can, and yeah, we will need the microphone for this. If you can raise your hand and just kind of list off what you consider to be a program, service, or activity within your community. If someone could raise their hand first, I would appreciate it, but I'm not afraid of awkward silence.
Village board meetings?
Board meetings, yes. And so it's the village board meeting, but it's also where that meeting's held. Someone else has their hand raised?
So we're the Cook County Forest Reserve, so we do a lot of programs in our forest reserves for the general public to come out to, whether it's nature walks, nature hikes, things like that, large-scale community events at times, so.
So yeah, it's those special, I'll call them one-off events. Those all are considered program services or activities, and those are all covered under the ADA. Anybody else have any ideas?
With the highway department, we do public meetings for a lot of our road projects.
And do you host those public meetings at your office, or do you sometimes host those closer to where the project is?
Typically, they're hosted within wherever the corridor is at.
So then that meeting and where you host that meeting has to be accessible.
And that's part of the process, to make sure that they're successful.
So yeah, so for road projects, a lot of the times we'll host those meetings where those residents live. So as we go out and identify, we have to make sure that those meetings are being hosted at an accessible location. So that's going to the church in advance, taking a look at it, things of that nature. Hold on to the microphone for a second.
All those various public service transaction spaces, permits, clerk for licensing, finance department for utility bill payments, things like that, all of those normal spaces. Although I did have a question. I'm from Geneva. We host a variety of public events, festivals, things of that nature throughout the year that are technically hosted through our Chamber of Commerce but with city participation. How would we approach events with these?
So you have to look at, where your obligation or liability is. So anytime that the city is sponsoring an activity, then you're liable, okay? Even if it's not your activity, but because you're a sponsor of the activity, you have liability. So if you're partnering with like the Chamber of Commerce, the Chamber of Commerce has liability too. Chamber of Commerce liability is under Title III of the ADA because that's where they're covered under the ADA for their public event. So they've got their Title III responsibilities, you've got your Title II responsibilities. Under the ADA, a Title II entity cannot provide significant financial support to an entity that discriminates against individuals with disabilities. So if you provide a sponsorship and you provide financial support or, in kind, even if it adds up, you provide police services, you're providing, whatever, those are all financial supports, you've got that liability. So it really cuts down to the table with that planning process, making sure that your voice is at the table to ask questions about accessibility, to make sure that you're holding your collaborator accountable for accessibility of the event, because if I was a person with a disability and I attend your event and it's not accessible, I can go after both of you. You both have liability.
Any other program services, anybody? We'll go through a list of these. I do think that this is really important because, like, as you mentioned with temporary events, I think there's a lot of programs and services that municipalities offer that we don't think about as having accessibility associated with them. If you have libraries and parks, I know there's park districts, library districts, but some communities have their own parks and libraries. Those have accessibility requirements. Playgrounds, bathrooms, things of that nature, that all falls under that. Recreation and education. If the city runs a baseball league and a child with a disability wants to play baseball, that child has the right to play baseball. So is there a plan in place? Is your facility set up for that? That's all part of this. Voting in elections, that's a big one. If you have any responsibility for voting in elections, your polling places have to be accessible, and then there's all other kinds of voting with the machines and everything else. Meetings, hearings, special events, we already hit on those a little bit. Police. Police is a program offered, is a service offered by the community. As we saw on both of those, civic access, Department of Justice takes a strong interest in the police department. If you read through a lot of those cases, police come up a lot. So how's your police department handling ADA? Web-based information and publications, everything that you put out on the internet has to be accessible. And what we found in a lot of communities is IT puts out stuff, and that tends to be pretty good, but then departments also have the ability to put out their own information. PDF forms, if your permit is available online, that needs to be an accessible permit. Or if they need help, who do they call to get help on those permits? Electric department, if you can pay your bill online, does it take you to an accessible website? Again, that's that third party conversation in which you can't just say, well, a third party handles this billing, they're responsible for it. They're handling your billing, which makes you responsible for it. Social services, warming shelters, homeless shelters, things of that nature. That all falls under it. Payments of fine, taxes, and assessments. We talked about that a little bit with, you have service counters all over your municipalities. Those all have obligations to be accessible. A big one that used to be argued a lot, I think it's been fairly settled now, is sidewalks and public rights-of-way is a program of your municipality. That's how we get into the self-evaluation for sidewalks and public rights-of-way. Is the legal cases have clearly established that sidewalks are a public program offered by a community. And lastly, those third-party, this is, whenever I do ADA transition plans, this is always a question we ask early. Do you have any more contracts with your third-party vendors that they are obligated to meet ADA accessibility? Because at the end of the day, if you pay a dog shelter to provide adoption services for you, and someone with a disability can't get into that shelter, again, that's two people getting sued in that case. That's the dog shelter, but that's your service. So now they're coming back at you as well. And then there's a lot of arguments over, well, you didn't tell me I had to make it accessible. So the easiest way to avoid that is, as you're going through that contract process, that is an obligation that you have on your third-party vendors, that they are responsible and that they have to provide accessibility.
Question. Oh, you said accessible website. What's an accessible website?
Oh, so this is debated a lot in the courts, all over the place. There are standards for accessibility for websites. The federal government passed one that's called Section 508, and that is the standard that the federal government adheres to for all of their websites, apps, kiosks, things of that nature. Then there is an international voluntary standard, which is called the World Wide Web Consortium Accessibility Guideline, which is a widely internationally recognized standard as well. The U.S. Department of Justice has indicated that an entity to be compliant under the ADA can meet either Section 508 or the World Wide Web Consortium's guidelines to be accessible. And what that means is that people with a variety of different disabilities can use your website. If you think about a website, it's extremely visual and graphic. If you take somebody who is blind, who can't see that website, that they need to be able to read that website using their technology. And their technology is typically what we call a screen reader, which is a piece of software that reads the content that's on the screen. So as long as you have text on the screen, it's great. But the problem is, it's how the text is organized. You and I look at the website, we will read left to right, and it doesn't matter how the code is or anything behind it, because we're graphically able to see it. The problem with the screen reader is the screen reader interfaces with that website, so if the code in the website isn't correct, it could have somebody jumping all over the website and not reading linearly, and not reading consistently. So you have to make sure your website is accessible. We use a lot of graphics on our website. When somebody uses a screen reader, they cannot read that graphic unless that graphic has been labeled to tell me what that graphic is. Otherwise, they get an error message, type of a thing. Forms that you have to fill out on the website. Unless that has been labeled correctly, I don't know that this is where my name goes. I don't know this is where my address goes. I don't know any of those kinds of things because it hasn't been labeled correctly. So there's a lot of things about the accessibility of your website that impacts people using different kinds of technology. Somebody who's blind or low vision will use what we call a magnifier on their computer, and it actually blows up the screen or magnifies the screen. If you haven't used the appropriate coding in your website for your pixels, it will stretch, and that will become distorted. We've all said that, right? Where you've taken a picture and you stretched it and it becomes distorted. That means that you didn't use the right coding for it to change in real time. So that if I magnify it, it changes, it magnifies instead of just stretching and becoming distorted. All of these there's a lot of different things. If I use video, a lot of us, our meetings, we have a Zoom, we record our meeting, we slap it up on the website. We have a press release or a press conference. We slap it up to YouTube, on the website or whatever. And unless it's captioned, somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing has no access. And we would even advocate sign language, because not everybody who is deaf or hard of hearing can use captioning, because sign language is very different than spoken English. So if I was going to say in English, I'm going to go to bed right now. In sign language, that would be now bed. That's the difference in how it's said in American Sign versus English. It's not signed English. They're not signing exactly what is being said. It's abbreviated communication. So if I'm somebody who is culturally deaf and I'm raised, and that's my language, reading your word for word in captioning will be very difficult for me, because that's not how my head thinks, and not how my brain thinks, and not how I'm understanding the information. So you really need to understand your audience and understand what you're doing in those things. But those are all part of the accessibility of the website. Yeah. Websites are huge, especially as we've gone more and more virtual, in what we do. Virtual City Hall. You don't have to come into City Hall anymore. You can almost do everything, virtually. And we're communicating with our citizens virtually also. I also would reinforce the fact it's not just your website, it's also your email. How many of you use some kind of stylized template on your email and with your logo on it and all the kind of thing and your signature line and everything? How many of you do that? How many have checked to make sure that your imaging and stuff on your email is accessible to somebody who uses screen reader? Yeah, it's a problem. So you also, it goes to your email. How many of you have apps? Any of you have community apps like 311 app or anything like that? I live in the city of Chicago with 311 app. Some of you have an app. Have you ever verified that your app is accessible to somebody who has a disability? These are all covered issues. Every single one of them. I'm going to talk more about that. But electronic access kiosks. Any of you have kiosks in your city hall that somebody can go into and not have to talk to a person, but do a transaction on a kiosk? Or placed anywhere around your communities for payment or anything of that nature? If you do ever do that, some entities do that, that's an issue for accessibility. Parking meters. How many of you have parking meter apps to pay your parking meters? That you can either go up to the little machine or you can use an app. If you go to that route, those are going to be covered under the ADA. I was just at the Village of Oak Park and had to use their app, and it wasn't accessible. So, oh, okay. Okay, now you need to look at that.
We'll have to talk later.
That parking app. Okay, sounds good. Sorry about that. Probably don't, but I just had that experience. Because I'm one of these people. A lot of my friends don't like to go out with me anymore because I evaluate everything for accessibility. It's like I can't go into a bathroom without coming out and telling my friends what's wrong with the bathroom. They expect it from me now, so it's just part of my thoughts. All right, specialized programs. Get a lot of questions from people about specialized programs. The ADA does not prohibit you from having specialized programs. What the ADA says is you cannot limit people with disabilities only to participating in those specialized programs. So there's nothing wrong with having a special recreation program. There's nothing wrong with having an autism-friendly program or anything of that nature. The issue is that you cannot limit people with disabilities to only participating in those specialized programs. So let's say you have a specialized program that you do on a regular basis for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And you know that program always has a sign language interpreter or whatever available for it. But the individual with disability doesn't want to participate in that specialized program. They want to go to the regular program, and they would still need a sign language interpreter to be able to participate. You still would need to consider a sign language interpreter for them to participate in that program that was not a specialized program, because they have a right to access that. Even though you have a program you can point to that says, well, but we have one already for people who are deaf and hard of hearing over here. Go to that one. No, I don't want to go to that one. You know, my friends are at that one. My friends are at this one. I want to go to this one. So you have to really consider that it's okay to have those programs, but you cannot restrict somebody to only participating in those programs. A program access or accessibility of your program, again, when you view your programs in entirety, does not require a fundamental alteration in the nature of the service, program, or activity. So you don't have to, so for example, we get a lot of questions about, am I required to stream my city council meetings? No, you're not required to stream your city council meetings, okay? We know we all kind of moved to that with the pandemic, and a lot of entities have moved away from that and have gone back to only in-person and are not streaming, etc. But you will have people with disabilities who will say, hey, it was great that during the pandemic you were streaming those meetings and I could participate. Because of my disability, I can't come to City Hall. I don't have transportation, I don't have whatever, to be able to, transportation doesn't run during the hours that, your city council meetings are run, because there's a limit of when transportation has to run, public transportation has to operate, et cetera, and just saying, hey, I want you to go back to, streaming your meetings so that I can participate. You're not required to stream your meetings. When you stream your meetings, they're required to be accessible. You could make an argument that we're not, all of our meetings are in person and we're not offering that virtual, because it's a fundamental alteration, because we don't we don't stream it, we're not going to stream it just for one person. We would advocate on the side of saying that streaming makes it accessible to everybody, including your citizens who can't leave because of babysitting issues, or citizens who can't leave because of other issues that are on the road and want to still catch the county, the city council meeting, et cetera, but they're out of town and they still want to be able to participate. So we look at those as being a universal access issue to make both in-person meetings accessible, virtual meetings, but the ADA wouldn't require you because of a citizen requesting you to stream the meeting, You're also not required to do something that would be a fundamental financial burden, undue burden, or administrative burden. This is a really hard one for municipalities and entities to argue as a defense. Because when you're looking at resources, you're looking at resources of the entire entity, not just the department that might be impacted by the budgetary issue. So you have somebody that says that they need a sign language interpreter to participate, and you're saying, well, but this department's budget, it doesn't have that in it, it wouldn't be able to afford it. We're talking about the resources of the overall entity. If I'm going to make an argument of undue hardship, I can't use it just that department's budget for undue hardship. And that's why you start looking at it being very difficult for municipalities to make an argument of undue hardship financially, because you're looking at your overall resources. Administrative burdens sometimes may be able to be argued. So somebody who's saying that they because of their disability they can't get there between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. to conduct business with the municipality. You could say it's an administrative burden for us to have somebody stay or be available to you at 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, or 8 o'clock at night because we're not open during that period of time and we require additional staffing. That could be argued as an administrative burden. But we would caution you to look at other alternatives of how you may be able to serve that person. So you might be able to serve that person through the mail or some other means. Look at alternatives of being able to serve that person when you're making those administrative hardship arguments. Some of the base requirements of a self-evaluation. Again, you heard the self-evaluation is to look at all of your programs, services, and activities. So examine them, including information technology, to identify where there is a barrier to people with disabilities. Evaluate how people receive benefits and services and how do they participate. Is it in person? Is it virtual? Is it by phone? How is the service conducted? How do people interface? Is it multiple ways? That we offer phone, we offer mail, we offer internet. A program may offer multiple access points or multiple ways that is conducted. All of that should be part of your evaluation or should be part of looking at your policies, practices, and procedures. And then develop a set of priorities, recommendations to ensure that your programs are accessible to people with disabilities. And this goes back a little bit to what Travis said about getting that feedback from people in your community about where those barriers are to them. And that's a really good driving point for you to start with. I look at that as your low-hanging fruit kind of thing, the things that people are already identified as being inaccessible, because those are the things that people are using most often. But that doesn't mean you ignore everything else, because even that thing that's only used once, even if it's used once, it needs to be accessible. So you look at that from a prioritization perspective. To start the evaluation process, you want to identify key personnel and look at interviewing them and any other staff to obtain the information. Because if you're the AD coordinator doing this or you're a committee doing this, you don't possibly have every bit of information about everything that goes on in every department and every unit. So you need to really be able to talk to the people who know what's going on and who run those programs and services and activities and can give you that information about what it is. And so you're looking for people who know the programs well, who know the policies and the procedures and the practices, because not everything's written down as a policy. Some things are just things, this is the way we've always done it. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, that becomes your policy. Even though it's not written down, and you don't have it actually on paper in it, if you've been practicing it that way, that's your policy. So you want to have somebody that knows those practices and knows those policies. And then who can identify any necessary documents that need to be reviewed as well. Who knows where those files are, and all those things to be able to look at. You need to really include those individuals in that process. Things to examine in your self-evaluation. is you want to look at things like participation requirements, both initial requirements as well as continuing. Do you have certain criteria in place? Do you have to be a citizen? Totally legitimate, you have to be a citizen. Do you have any other kind of criteria, however, that could be discriminatory? Things like must be able to see, must be able to hear, must be able to write, must be able to speak, any of those kinds of criteria. Believe it or not, you start to look at things like your municipal courts and stuff like that. I can bet you might have some policies, practices, procedures in some of those there that talk about very specific things like being able to talk, hear, and things that they can read, if they're going to be part of those processes and things. You really need to look at those issues. Testing, do you do any testing? Are there any qualification requirements for that testing that need to be looked at? Would it potentially be discriminatory? Do you have any participation policies and practices that may be discriminatory? Again, anything that would say that somebody has to be sound mind and body, or believe it or not, I've seen policies that have been written that way that say it must be a sound mind and body. I don't know many of us that could probably meet that criteria even on a good day. Look at those kinds of things. Do we have anything that says that you have to be able to see, again, or hear, or walk, or stand, or anything of that nature? It's really about the outcome versus the process, because you can accommodate the process. Somebody who doesn't see, you give them materials in an accessible format. Somebody who doesn't hear, you give them sign language interpreters for real-time captioning. Somebody who can't walk, you let them sit, or something of that nature. So you really do look closely at that kind of criteria to make sure you're not including that unless it's absolutely necessary or part of that, like a safety issue or something of that nature. That's a legitimate safety issue. I cannot tell you how many times I hear from entities that say, well, we have to have this in there because of a potential risk. And I'm almost like, what is the potential risk? Everybody and anything is a potential risk. Everybody is a potential risk. What is the imminent nature of that potential risk before you start to exclude individuals or people? Look at your existence of separate programs and services, making sure that they have criteria, that you're not forcing people into that, you're not steering people into that, you're not making that the exclusionary program for people with disabilities, and then effective communication. We're going to dive into these things in a little bit more detail as we go. I've always asked this, what is effective communication? Well, effective communication is, can you and I talk to each other? Can you and I communicate? That's what effective communication is. Do you understand what I'm telling you? And do I understand what you're telling me? Then we've had effective communication. How we communicate so that it's effective will differ. But the bottom line is we've achieved effective communication when you understand what I said and I understand what you said. That's the bottom line of effective communication. All right. Infrastructure, including transportation. How many of you provide any kind of level of transportation other than PACE or whatever? Anybody have any services that you're offering locally, internally, in your communities, like through aging services or anything of that nature? Some of you are. Those have to be accessible. Okay? And the eligibility criteria for those have to be non-discriminatory. Now, we always get questions about the fact that, well, that you have to be a citizen to use them. Is that, discriminatory if you have a person with a disability who is visiting the community and wants to use that? You illegitimately can have criteria that says you have to be a citizen to be able to access or use those particular services. Now, public transportation, PACE, et cetera, they have all requirements for reciprocity for individuals who have qualified for paratransit or whatever in another community. Like I come from Champaign and I come to Chicago and travel, PACE has to recognize my paratransit eligibility in Champaign and let me ride, paratransit services. But you're not providing paratransit services, you're providing other types of transportation services, so your criteria is a little bit different. So you could have an eligibility criteria of being a citizen. All right. Emergency preparedness. This is an area that falls short a lot of times for entities. We're going to talk more in detail of that. How are we including and making sure that all aspects of disability-related issues are, considered? How are we? What are our policies related to service animals and things that people have, and being able to use our shelters and bringing their animals, with them? How are we transporting people with disabilities if there's been a fire and we're providing some kind of shelter or something of that nature, and we've got individuals with disabilities who have electric wheelchairs? How are we transporting them from the scene of the fire to where we might be providing shelter or other kinds of social services to them, type of thing. Use of outside entities and their compliance, Travis talked about that, and we were talking about furniture and equipment and purchasing procedures that we're using. Are we ensuring that accessibility is part of those purchasing procurement agreements? I can't tell you how many municipalities I have worked with that have purchased new telephone systems and never gave into consideration whether or not those telephone systems were compatible with the T2I and or were compatible with hearing aid. Key issue. Need to do that. How many of us have purchased software? We don't know necessarily we have an employee with a disability at the present time, but we might have an employee with a disability in the future. How many of us are purchasing software and ensuring that the software that we're purchasing is accessible in our procurement contract? How many of us are we looking at purchasing of equipment? Are we ensuring that the equipment, the furniture, etc., includes elements of accessibility? If we're purchasing new furniture for the front lobby, are we considering accessibility of that furniture in the front lobby? Are we taking into consideration geriatric? Are we taking into consideration that benches that we're putting outside, etc., that there's accessibility to those benches, or that there's accessible benches, or picnic tables, or any of those kinds of things? And then our web-based information, which we kind of alluded to already, we're talking more again about, which is your kiosks, apps, etc., in addition to just your website. All right, so look at your handouts, and this is another one, just a guide to look at, something that is available as a template to think about. The first one that you should be looking at is called the Departments and Programs. This is a great little tool to be used as to start to collect your inventory of what are your programs and your services, etc. So this comes from what is known as the Title II Action Guide, Title II Action Guide. And the Title II Action Guide is a document that was created by the International Network, which is what I'm part of. And this is a tool that is available to you it's a web-based tool, available to municipalities with a lot of different checklists that you can use as templates to start the process, to start collecting information. People sometimes get overwhelmed with how do I start collecting that information, what do I start to collect, etc. So the first one here is Departments and Programs. And you'll see that basically it just says that this is where you would start to list what your programs are. And so you heard Travis talk earlier, it goes about what are the different programs. This is where you start to dissect what are all those programs and start to get them on paper. It's one thing to talk through and list them, and verbally, another thing to document them. And this is where you then would start to look at, okay, who's the staff person that's responsible for that program? Who is when do we evaluate it, and what are the comments related to that? So this would be kind of like our inventory sheet to look at as to what we are doing. This isn't the actual sheet that I would record the evaluation on. This is where I'm recording and starting my process to inventory what are all my programs, so I get a handle on what do I need to evaluate. So this is where I sit down and kind of start to think through that, right? So when you think about your programs and services, so when you talk about like festivals, some of you have festivals that are sponsored by the village or the city. Some of you have festivals that are done by private entities but use city facilities. Okay? So there's a difference there in that regard. When you are the landlord, it's very different than when you are an acting entity. So when you're the landlord, you don't have obligations. It's the entity that's hosting the event that has obligations. So if I have an inaccessible building and somebody's going to use that inaccessible building and we're not part of it, we're just allowing somebody to use that inaccessible building, then it's not our obligation for the accessibility of that event. It's whoever's hosting that event's responsibility for that issue. However, as soon as we sponsor that activity, now we are hooked in, as we were talking about earlier in that situation. And using that inaccessible building would be extremely problematic because now we're liable for that particular issue and event. Okay? So it's an ongoing issue to look at what are our programs, but include those programs where we sponsor, where we are a sponsor of any type of that program. If our name is going on in any way, shape, or form, then we're going to have liability. Also, think about whether or not you need to break down your activities. So someone talked about meetings that you have, like for when you're doing construction projects or whatever else it may be. That's one type of meeting. How is that meeting run? You know, is that pretty much we talk at you and there's a little bit of, you know, public, input or whatever? That's different than a town hall kind of an event where it's an open forum where everybody, you know, is talking and everybody is welcome to talk and anybody can come and present and anybody can do it anytime. So think about the events that you're hosting and the differences in the kinds of events that you're having. You know, there's a difference between a talking head and a multi-audiovisual and, multi-sensory experience or event or activity. You may have to consider captioning and real-time captioning. If you're showing a video, is the video, you know, captioned or, or sign language with the video, or et cetera, that you're using? Again, also understand that if you are going to be recording it and putting it on your website, then even if you didn't have a request for someone to have real-time captioning or sign language in the actual meeting that you had, so you didn't have it at that meeting, as soon as you put it on your website, it's open to the world, which means you can't control who views it, which means it needs to be fully accessible. So this is something that happens oftentimes. People will say, well, we hosted the meeting, nobody requested a sign language interpreter or real-time captioning during the meeting, so we did not provide it, yet we recorded it, and then we put it on our website. Whoops. Now we got a problem, because now we put up inaccessible content on our website. Yes?
So you're saying...
Hold up.
Thank you. So you're saying if we have public meetings on our website, we can sign language?
If you have public meetings, what I'm talking about this is that you held a public meeting. It was not on your website, but it was an in-person, but you filmed it, and then you posted it after the fact on your website. Okay, so the obligations that you had for that in-person meeting was, did we have notice to the public that if you needed an accommodation to participate in the meeting, we gave you notice, nobody contacted us, so we didn't have sign language, we didn't have real-time captioning, but we videoed it. And now after the meeting, we took that video and we put it up on our website for anybody to view at any time, 24/7. Now, that video better be accessible, because if I'm deaf or hard of hearing, I have a right to access that video that you posted on your website for the public. So now that video needs to be accessible. So now you either, after the fact, retrofit it to be accessible, and or you made the meeting accessible so you already had those things, so when it was videoed, it was incorporated into the video. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, you have like a village council meeting, you record it, and then you publish it on the website. Do the minutes being published with that suffice for that?
Very debatable. A transcript is not the same, because I then can't see what's going on, because I'm stuck reading the transcript and I can't see what's going on. So why did you video it, and why aren't you making just the minutes of the transcript available to everybody, and why are you giving people access to the video? I mean, that's the question to ask, right? Is that equal access? Yeah.
I don't not disagree with you.
Yeah. I mean, but that's the argument, right? So that's the old adage of, I'm going to go on a tour, and they're going to, and I've seen this happen prior to the ADA. Let's say you're on the architecture tour, on the lake, on the river, and you're somebody who's deaf, and they hand you a transcript. This is what the person is saying about everything that's going on, in the tour. And you're sitting reading the transcript, and you never get to see what is happening or what's going on, during the meeting. Board meetings have, PowerPoints. They have a lot of, discussion. There's a lot of things. People want to see what's going on. And why? Again, it goes to why am I filming it then? Why am I not just getting everybody just a transcript? Yeah.
Just to follow up this question, will the closed caption words at the bottom suffice in lieu of sign language?
Okay, so captioning is one form of effective communication, and it is used by people who can read English and don't hear, and understand that real-time captioning is used by a wide variety of people, not just people who are deaf and hard of hearing. In fact, the one of the highest users of real-time captioning as people who, for which English is not, is a second language, because it reinforces what they're hearing and what they're seeing, etc. People who have low vision, who have hard of hearing, and who are deaf are your other big users of captioning. Captioning is one form, but again, as I said earlier, there are some individuals for which written word is not effective for them because of the way that they have learned to communicate. So somebody who's culturally deaf, reading, depending on their level of education and such, it may not be effective for them to read the English because they're not good in and proficient in reading English, because that's not what they have as their first language, because American Sign Language is their first language. And again, it's a very different context. It's not the same as written word. So captioning is the fallback for most things. But again, I'll even say, if you're relying on Zoom auto captioning, it is only about 75% accurate from the studies that have been done. So even if you rely on the auto-generated or AI captioning in Zoom, you should still go back and edit. And I'll give you a perfect example. I did a training for the city of Chicago when Mayor Daley was in office. And if you remember back at all, Mayor Daley, he loved to see himself on camera. He was like camera happy. And so everything he did was filmed and was on their YouTube channel or whatever, the city's camera. Every press release, everything he did. And I was doing a training, and so I was doing an accessibility training for them on information technology, and I was going through their videos and things of that nature. And I found one that was posted, and it was when they had hired a new fire chief who was African American. And Mayor Daley was introducing, this person. And so he did his thing and everything of that nature, and they used the auto transcribe for the captioning, and they posted it on their website. Well, one of the statements that he made in the process of his introduction of this person is that I hired the best man for the job. Well, what the AI did was I hired the black man for the job. Now, I don't think that's what Mayor Daley wanted to have conveyed in his message, but that's what, if I was somebody who was deaf and saw the captioning, or anybody who turned the captioning on, that's what I saw. So you really need to go back and edit that automatic captioning to make sure that it is accurate and correct and reflects what you intended to have it say. Don't rely on it 100% as being accurate. So it's a good start, and if you don't know, it's very easy to edit that captioning. We do it all the time in our office. It's a file that you just go in and edit, and pop it back in, and it works out great. It's time-stamped, and it works out fine, but it does take a little bit more effort. It probably, I would say, we do a 90-minute webinar on a regular basis, and I would say it takes my staff about 30 minutes to go in and edit and correct any of the words that are incorrect. Particularly AI is very problematic with anybody who has an accent. It's very problematic in formal word names and things of that nature. Very problematic if you're using any technical language. So particularly if you're doing anything in the construction area where you might be talking specific terminologies that's not in the AI vocabulary, those are problematic. So just be aware of those limitations, and you can use that. Sign language is, if I was going to advocate for best practice, I'd say sign language and captioning should be provided. I'm not going to tell you have to have both sign language and captioning on your video. I'm saying it's best practice, definitely minimally captioning should be on your video. However, if during your live meetings you have somebody who requests sign language, and you also have somebody who has requested real-time captioning, do not think that you only have to provide one to get two. That person who's requesting sign language is requesting it for a specific reason, typically because they don't understand written English and they need sign language. Our rule of thumb is when you have those conversations, when you have those requests, your ADA coordinator or whoever coordinates those things should have a conversation with the person who's requested it and let them know that there will be real-time captioning already available. Will that work for you, or do you need sign language? It's perfectly okay to ask that question. Because sometimes people will request sign language because they don't know there's going to be real-time captioning. So they're preferred to sign language, but they could use real-time captioning. So it's okay to have that conversation with them. I had a conference one time, made a huge mistake in regards to some documents, because I had some people who were registered that were blind and had requested Braille. And I had a huge packet of materials back when we didn't use electronics and we copied everything for my conference. And so the person requested Braille, so I went and Brailled everything for that conference for that person. And it was huge. It was huge. We got there and the person was like, oh, I don't want that. I only needed the agenda in Braille. I wanted everything else. You could have given me everything else electronically. But he didn't know what we were going to even hand out, because when you register for a conference, you don't know what's going to be given. It was my failure to not go back to him and talk to him and clarify, this is what we're going to be handing out. Do you want all this in Braille? He didn't want that huge stack of information in Braille. It was useless to him because he couldn't even carry it home in his suitcase. He wanted all of that stuff for reference in electronically, but he didn't know I was going to be handing it out because he can't read my mind. And I took his needing Braille as he needed everything in Braille because I failed to have the conversation. So it's okay to have those conversations. That's something that should happen. Should clarify, make sure that you're providing an effective accommodation for somebody in that regard. All right. I'm going to give you an example of a program and how you would look at breaking it down and such. So take a public hearing. We'll talk public hearings. So this is the applicable. Assume certain things. The meeting is held to conduct city business and communicate with residents of the city or recipients of a specific program. It may be held in person or remote, or both. Some are held on a regular basis. Some are responsive to urgent situations, fiscal issues, emergencies, etc. You should include each type of meeting that may be held in your assessment. Assessment for remote meetings, assessment for in-person meetings, assessment for hybrid, because they're totally different of what you're going to need and what you're looking at. Meetings that are held last minute, that would be a separate type of a meeting because your communication issues are going to be different. Your notice issues are going to be different. You're not going to have as much time. So if I have a policy that we need 14 days notice for a sign language interpreter, but I'm calling a meeting 3 days from now, I better have a different policy, practice, and procedure related to how I'm going to deal with effective communication for that meeting I'm calling in 3 days. Does this make sense? How you have to look at it? So it's not as simple to say, oh, this and this. You really need to think about how we do and what we do and how these things are impacted as we go. And that's why that inventory is really important to think through and get it down on paper and have other people look at it to see whether or not we've done or not done what we need to do. Okay, determine that all meetings are held that are accessible. Is notice to the public made, and how do we request accommodations to participate? Are all materials and announcements for the meeting accessible? What does that mean? Does that mean that we put it on our website? It's accessible on our website. We created a flyer and hung it up someplace. We have other means for people. Did we only use a flyer? Did we send out an email blast about it? Was that email blast accessible? An email had an attachment to it that was the flyer. Is the PDF flyer accessible? Okay, PDF means portable digital format. It does not mean accessible format. It can be made accessible, but that means whoever created that document had to know what they were doing and made it accessible. It should be the policy, practice, and procedure in your organizations that every document that is created for public distribution, whether you know a person with disability or not is going to use it, is accessible. Build it, and they shall come. Don't build it when you come. It will cost you a lot more money, a lot more time, and a lot more effort to retrofit. Think accessible from the ground up. You'll be much farther ahead. And then do people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate? So, if it's an opportunity to give public comment, people have equal opportunity. If it's a seating, everything from the seating issues to the communication issues, all of those things to people having equal opportunity to participate. And think about the fact that, you've got people who can't travel because of their disability, can't come because of their disability or whatever. Do they still have a means of opportunity to participate potentially? All right. Assume facts that you have businesses that's being carried out in person or by telephone or technology. Meetings to the public, in person or virtual. How are you handling sign language interpreters and captioning process? Are you making notice to the public? Are you giving people advance notice of how to request these kinds of accommodations? Do you even know how to arrange these kinds of accommodations? So determine how you're going to communicate and what would be needed if somebody needed to request a sign language interpreter in advance of the meeting. How much time do you need? We have a relationship with X, Y, and Z interpreting service, X, Y, and Z captioning service. They need 2-week notice. So that means we need to make sure that we are doing a 2-week notice for people letting us know that they need that. We advocate a policy of you schedule proactively, and then you only consider canceling if you haven't had a request. By scheduling proactively, you know that you have the service arranged. You don't have to scramble and worry about it. And then if you don't get a request, you can make a decision of whether you cancel that. The entity I use requires a 48-hour cancellation notice without penalty. The service I use through my office. You would need to find that out from your organization or entity. But we would advocate for proactivity because what happens is it's hard to find sign language interpreters and real-time captioners last minute. So you have an obligation to provide it. You could be spending a lot of time spinning your wheels, calling a million zillion vendors trying to arrange it if you cut your time frame too short. And you don't know what's going on. Okay? Have a proactive statement. If you are providing those accommodations, have them make sure that it's proactively identified in your announcements, etc. If you're reactive, so that this meeting will have sign language interpreter. This meeting will have captioning available. Let people know that up front if you already are having that. If it's reactive, and that we'll only provide it if you request it, make sure you have a statement of how to request it and what the time frame is to request it. Make sure your time frame is reasonable. A month out is not going to be reasonable. You can decide whether you want to come and go to a meeting at the last minute. A person with a disability who has to request an accommodation has to plan in advance whether they're going to attend the meeting. Is that equal access? No, but that's the way the rules are written. So think about how much you can proactively provide that unless it's not requested. Okay. What is your process for securing the services? What's your budget allocation? Whose budget is it under? Is it a centralized budget? Or is it a departmental budget? How are you doing that? Where are those funds coming from? Who are your vendors? Have agreements in place? Identify your community. Do we have any sign language interpreters or real-time captioners living in our community? Start there. You might have somebody local that you can hire. That's an investment in your community, etc. Is it a decentralized or centralized? Do all requests go through one office, one person, or is every department on their own if they have these requests to make their own arrangements? If that's the case, does everybody know what to do? Do they have this training and skills in how to do it and how to problem solve? These are decisions you have to make as an organization and entity. Is there an internal process for securing? Again, do we confirm that it's available? What about placement and seating? Where's the sign language interpreter? Okay, we're having a meeting. We're in this room. We're in Frankfurt, and it's going to be video. It's streamed theirs on Facebook. Okay, or no, YouTube. I think it was. They said. I think it was YouTube. They stream it on YouTube. Okay. So now they have a request for sign language interpreter. Where is that sign language interpreter going to be in the room so that it's also captured in the video? Also, do I know that little known fact that if I have more than an hour meeting, I have to have 2 interpreters because they can't interpret continuously. But do I know that if I'm doing a virtual meeting and I have a sign language interpreter who is remote, if I'm streaming on YouTube, somebody has to manually switch the cameras back and forth to make sure that the sign language interpreter shows up on YouTube. If you don't do that, the sign language interpreter will not show up on YouTube. That's somebody, whoever's doing that, needs to know that, because it's pointless now if your sign language interpreter is there and nobody can see it because you don't have a staff person that knows how to use a sign language interpreter in a virtual environment. It's not as easy and as simple as you think. These are all part of what needs to be part of your evaluation and your process and your policies and your procedures. Again, lighting, setup, electricity, you know, we need to be plugged in. If we're a real-time capture, I need to have some place I can plug in, etc. And whoever's running the meeting needs to know how to use the sign language interpreter and how to use the real-time captioner. It's very difficult for a real-time captioner to caption over 3 people talking at the same time. It's impossible for a sign language interpreter to sign for somebody if there's multiple conversations going on in the room at the same time. So there's got to be control of the conversation, there's got to be amplification available, etc. All of these things are part of your planning and need to be part of your setup and implementation as well. Again, it goes into your assessment process. All right. Pull out go to the next program accessibility. So again, this is another document for being able to list all of your programs that are not accessible. So you have the departments and programs one. The next one is program accessibility. This is the sample checklist that would usually use for identifying all of your facilities that are not accessible. Okay? So if you have buildings and facilities that aren't accessible, if you know that are not accessible, these will be part of your inventory and identify what programs go on currently in that building, okay, or in that facility, and then you're going to identify what's our alternative to offering that program that's in that inaccessible building in another manner or another way. So it's a way to start to get a handle on where do we have our inaccessible programs operating and what is our alternative that we're offering for somebody. So we relocate to a different building, or we offer it at more than one location. We offer it at the inaccessible location, but you can also get the same service someplace else that's accessible. And we advertise that that would be the accessible location for somebody to go to. So if we have an office that somebody needs to get permitting from or payments or something of that nature, it may be in an accessible location, we'll accept payments also over here. That's an alternative to that accessibility. Okay? All right. So, transition plans. We've talked a lot about the self-evaluation, and we're going to continue to talk about that, but I want to talk a minute about the transition plan. You've heard that there's going to be 2 sessions that are going to focus on transition plans, primarily with sidewalks and public rights and other things of that nature. Do not forget that a transition plan also includes all of your buildings and facilities that you operate your programs and services and activities in. So while the focus in those 2 sessions is going to be on public rights of way and such, it's really important that you understand you have the obligation to complete that transition plan for all of your buildings and facilities. So, with looking at a transition plan for buildings and facilities, you should really do a review of all of your buildings and facilities where you hold programs that are open to the public. So, one would say, do I have to do a transition plan assessment on my salt barn? Well, your salt barn, you really don't need to do a transition plan unless you hold public activities in your salt barn. So, for example, I knew a municipality that the salt barn was a drop-off point for Christmas tree recyclers. Okay, open to the public, at least for that particular time or whatever. So wherever I'm doing that Christmas tree recycling, that's an area of that salt barn that is open to the public, which would need to be addressed as to whether or not it's accessible or not. All right? Not the entire salt barn. So you really have to look at even those buildings that we say, oh, the public never comes to. Oh, but they do occasionally because we have this kind of special activity that occurs once a year at that location or whatever. Now we gotta look at it. We have at least that area that is open to the public. Develop a list of where the physical barriers exist and identify methods and make the facilities accessible. Some of you may have buildings that are inaccessible for the next 100 years. As long as you don't hold any public programs or activities in that building, go for it. You know, don't waste your resources on it. Now, if you happen to have an employee with a disability who's going to work in that building that's inaccessible, that's not open to the public, but is used by employees, you may need to make changes in that building as a reasonable accommodation for somebody with a disability. But that's a separate consideration under your employment obligations under the ADA versus what we're talking about today, which is your public accommodations under the ADA. But keep in mind that at the same time you're evaluating your buildings and facilities for public access, it is good practice to also think about our employees with disabilities, or our potential for employees with disabilities, because we as Title II entities should be model employers for people with disabilities, and should reflect your citizenry in your employment makeup as well. So think about this as you go through it and look at those kinds of things. Establish a schedule to get the work completed, seeking input from the public regarding your priorities. So once you've collected all of your barriers and you've looked at where all those barriers are, this is a key point where the public comes in. We're going to talk more about that in future sessions, but public input on what prioritization is really going to be critically important in how you decide what we tackle first, second, and third. If this is where people go majority of the time, this is where my liability is going to be. Because this is where I'm more likely to get a complaint filed for somebody using on a regular basis and it being inaccessible versus something that is rarely used or infrequently used or accessed by the public. Make sure you identify who's responsible for carrying out the plans and limitations, recognizing that we know that staff change. So we recommend that it not be who's responsible by person, but by who's responsible by position. Because Joe might leave next 6 months. So that plan becomes pretty obsolete if Joe was responsible for doing something. But Joe's position will be replaced, hopefully, depending on budgetary issues. And so hopefully, whoever goes into Joe's position knows that that's their responsibility of their position in their office to do that. So be careful not to identify by people, but to identify by positions or departments for responsibility. And then make sure you periodically review it to make sure that you're on track and that you're making progress, or make adjustments as needed. Maybe when we originally developed our plan, we said that we were going to be doing something in a 2-year, 24-month period. But hey, COVID hits. Nothing happened in those 20 months or whatever happened. So our time frame gets thrown off. That's easy to happen. We need to go back then and adjust our time frames accordingly, rationale why, etc., and recalculate when that will take place or when that will happen. So again, what should be included in a transition plan? All your physical barriers that limit programmatic access. Detail your methods that you're going to use to make them accessible. Again, are we going to change it physically? Are we going to relocate it? What are we going to do to make it accessible? Schedule what steps you're going to take in a year or whatever to achieve your compliance. What's your 3-year plan, whatever. And again, who's responsible for its implementation. Coordinate your facility access solutions with your operations, maintenance, procurement, and various program providers to ensure that you are consistently looking at this issue of program access in practice. It's not just the people who do the sidewalks. It's not just the person who is responsible for plowing. It's not just, everybody has a role in this particular issue. So you need to make sure that it's coordinated among the various parties and entities that have something to say about that. To ensure that you've got things coordinated to implement your program accessibility and make sure that your program ends up being accessible. Understand, as I said and I've been reiterated, the program access does not necessarily mean that you have to make physical changes. It can be relocating, it can be providing things in a different location altogether, delivery of services instead of requiring somebody to come and pick something up. You can offer a delivery option or a door option. Pick up at the door option, etc. So just think about, it doesn't always have to be a physical access change. Sometimes things can't be made physically accessible, or again, as your alternative, while your 10-year plan is playing out, you might offer these other options as an interim option along the way. Give priority to making sure that services are provided in the most integrated setting possible. Again, make sure that you don't say, oh, well, for people without disabilities, you can be served over here. For people with disabilities, yeah, you have to go over here. And it's kind of, it's kind of off the beaten path or whatever, but, hey, at least it's accessible. Make sure that it's done in the most integrated manner that you can. So here's just an example of a City Hall facility looking at some issues of program accessibility. Assume that the building is open to the public on a regular basis. Residents can come to City Hall to carry out a variety of activities, including paying bills, attending meetings, applying for services and benefits, and meeting with leadership when needed. There's a public parking lot that serves the building, and the restrooms are open to the public. In looking at this building, determine all areas where the public has access. Identify any barriers that impede access to areas where the public is served. So there may be areas in the City Hall that the public doesn't go to and it's only accessed by staff. Your focus should be on those areas where the public accesses. Evaluate against the 2010 Standards for Accessibility and the Illinois Accessibility Code. Don't forget the Illinois Accessibility Code. And if you and some municipalities have your own local jurisdictional code that you, because of home rule or whatever that you've adopted, make sure that you are in accordance with that as well. And then identify any physical barriers that may impede an employee with a disability. So also make sure you identify areas used only by employees so that you know where those barriers are, so that if you have an employee with a disability, you can address those issues as a reasonable accommodation. So again, don't forget non-public areas, but your priority is the public areas. Your employment response is based on employee by employee reasonable accommodation. How do I know if I have been successful or not? Well, if you've identified all your programs and you make them all accessible to people with disabilities, you've definitely achieved your success. And if you report each one accurately and completely, you've obviously been successful. You all have room for improvement. Even those of you that think you're doing it great, you probably have things that can be improved upon. So always think about it, how can I do it better? Keep that as my goal, how can I do it better? The purpose of the evaluation self-transition plan is not to point fingers at all. Oh, your department didn't do what they were supposed to do. You didn't do what you were supposed to do. The previous administration didn't follow through with what they were supposed to do. That's irrelevant, it's not useful, or whatever. It is to spot problems and correct those problems to make sure that your citizens can be served and that you as a city are not putting yourself in any liable position. Again, by identifying problems gives you an opportunity to improve upon them. If I don't know where my problems are, I can't improve my services or my programs. So, any specific questions about accessibility of programs themselves? Yeah.
I'm coming.
Yeah, they're getting them to you.
Thanks. I just wanted to inquire about what is the mandate for how the frequency of self-evaluations and updating the transition plan? Because the only thing I've seen from what we've gone through is it was required by 1995.
Right, correct.
Or I think 93, whatever.
Well, it was
3 years following the
Yeah,
implementation.
yeah. Mhm, yeah. Yeah, so great question. So if you asked the DOJ right now, if you said to them, do I have to have self-evaluation and a transition plan? They would say, no, regulatorily, those deadlines have passed. But then they will also say to you, do you have any barriers? Because the assumption would be, you've already done the self-evaluation and transition plan. You completed it by 1995. You removed all your barriers. You are fully in compliance. You have no barriers or problems. And all of your citizens have equal access currently to all your program services and activities. How many of you can say with 100% accuracy and assurance that that's the case? Right, none of us can, right? So what DOJ has said is, these are tools for you to achieve compliance and to assure that you maintain compliance. Because I also cannot tell you how many buildings I have visited that were constructed since 1991, or since 2012 when the 2010 standards went into effect, that are still not in compliance with the ADA or the Illinois Accessibility Code because of the failure of whoever was constructing, whoever was doing the building permits, and the final occupancy permits failed to catch. Because the reality is accessibility is not sexy. It's not the top thing on that code official's checklist when they go in. You know, they're focused on the HVAC, they're focused on the electricity, they're focused on, you know, water safety, and all those other kinds of things. Oh yeah, the bathroom, how wide is it? Oh yeah, this, you know, kind of thing. Those are not the first things that they're checking off in that scenario. And so these things get missed. The reality also is, we know it, the architect could have designed a perfectly accessible plan that got approved by your building department, and the permits were issued, but the contractor came in and took latitude and said, yeah, you know, I don't quite have 18 inches, I'm going to do a 17-inch toilet. No, it's an 18-inch, you know? So, you know, well, it actually is a range, but it used to be, it was the absolute, but that was a bad example for me to use right now. But, you know, they do this all the time. Or they pour the sidewalk and they look at the cross slope and, oh, you know, I'm a quarter percentage off. Well, for a person with a disability, using a wheelchair, manually pushing the wheelchair, that cross slope is critical. So that quarter, whatever that you did and you screwed up, that's a liability. That's critical. Even though it was scoped out all correctly and everything else. So that's where the liability is, and that's why you really need to understand where your barriers are and how they can be removed and how they can be prevented in the future. Because that's part of this process as well. Okay? All right, so facility access, again, when you're doing your facility access, all meetings facilities need to be accessible to people with disabilities under the ADA. All, we recommend that you indicate if there is an accessibility problem, that you provide information if there is, wherever the location of the meeting is, if there's only one entrance that's accessible, identify which one is accessible to the public so that they know, are there accessible parking available on the north side of the building or whatever else it might be, because not everybody knows what all your accessibility features are, etc. So include those kinds of things in this kind of information. Understand that people cannot be refused participation because of like a safety risk. You heard in that video that Judy said oftentimes she was told she was a fire risk or whatever. People cannot be denied access because being said a safety risk. Again, look at eligibility criteria. Are things, do you require things like a driver's license? Well, if I don't drive, I don't have a driver's license. Well, maybe an alternative is a state ID. What do our policies say about those kinds of things? Do we have those alternatives in that process? Do we have, and we offer other kinds of things? A thumbprint, for somebody who can't sign, but you need a legal signature. What other things will you accept in regards to those kinds of things? You need to have alternatives. Also understand you cannot charge people for the accommodations that you may be providing with them, for them. So you have somebody who is requesting sign language interpreter, you can't charge them a fee for that sign language interpreter in your special recreation, in your recreation programs or such. Even though there's a fee for the swimming class, you can charge the fee for the swimming class, but you can't charge me an additional fee because I need a sign language interpreter for the swimming class. You only can charge me as much as what that would be to do that. If you're doing testing, make sure that all tests are inclusive, that people with disabilities can participate. Can they be offered in an alternative manner? Somebody may not be able to take the test on a computer, and they take it on paper. Instead, what kind of alternatives can we offer individuals in that kind of situation? Somebody might need a sign language interpreter during a testing process because they're a problem with reading written English. Now again, if what I'm testing is your ability to understand written English, then it would not be an appropriate accommodation to provide me a sign language interpreter because I need to test how you comprehend written English. But if I only am testing your knowledge of a concept, then sign language interpreter would be appropriate for that. Again, making sure all your meetings and things are accessible, physical accessible, as well as auxiliary aids and services. So as you go through and make your determination of all of your evaluation, these are things that you're going to be looking at in each element of these. Again, it applies to all meetings, no matter whether they're held and where they're held, if they're open to the public. Again, if they're held in your facilities, or you're holding them out in the community, at the church, or at the senior center, or whatever else. Yes? Question? Thanks, I didn't see the hand.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned swimming pools. I was going to ask that question.
Sure.
We talk about sign language, I'm not talking about that, but more about a lift. I was working on a project where we received a grant for a swimming pool, and the architect was expecting a lift or some type of way to get individuals that have a wheelchair in a swimming pool. Is that something required by the ADA?
Yes, it is more than 300 linear feet. Yep.
Thank you.
And depending on the size of the pool, you may have to have more than one option for access. So I really would refer you back to the standards in the ADA because it talks about the size of the pool and the type of entry that you use. There's flexibility in that. So depending on the pool, the size of the pool, et cetera. So we see pools now that are zero effort, zero entry. Yes, I want to say they're like a beach, right? So you start at one end and you gradually go down and you have to have a handrail on there and stuff of that nature. The lift is another option. Transfer steps or transfer, steps, where somebody would transfer and butt bump down into the pool. So there's different options, but you really need to look at the standards because it's triggered by the size of the pool. And that also includes spas. So it includes things like whirlpools and stuff as well. Make sure you definitely look at those. But yes, they are required. They were actually required even if you did do new construction. So if you have an existing pool, you are required to address, this was a new requirement that came in the 2010 regulations under the ADA for existing pools also, especially if they're owned and operated by a local government, because you have the obligation for program access, which means you need to make the program of swimming accessible. So even if I did construct this, again, it goes down. How do I know if my program is accessible? I have to look at my program, where are the barriers to the program. Swimming pool is an excellent example. If I'm a person with disability, how do I get in the pool? So I would, even though in new construction I absolutely have to have modes of entry, I also have to look at my existing pool and how am I going to create access into my existing pool. Yes. He's counting there. Get your exercise day. We should put a pet out here.
I don't want to go too far down the swimming pool rabbit
That's okay.
hole, but would it be a reasonable accommodation in that circumstance? Say you had a 40-year-old existing swimming pool that was pre-ADA, to provide a helper for an individual that needed it? Because that would certainly be a far more cost-effective, accommodation for the municipality.
Yes, I see where it would be cost effective. However, I have a right to dignity. I have a right to independent access. You can get in and out of the pool whenever you want to get in the pool. I should be able to get in and out of the pool whenever I want to. So a portable lift could be an answer in that situation, or whatever. But yeah, it's not appropriate to require somebody to ask for assistance to get in and out of the pool. Now, if somebody asks for assistance to use the lift, fine, you should provide them assistance. If I have a zero entry even, that doesn't mean everybody can use it. Somebody might still need assistance to get into the pool even then. The issue is I need to have the accessibility features. It's up to me as the person with the disability is whether I can use them or not. But I should be given the access or the option to use them. So yeah. Providing physical assistance is not considered an answer to an accommodation under the ADA. Now, with caveats. So for example, automatic doors are not required under the ADA. Okay, I wish they were. And I advocate for them, but they are not required under the ADA. So I can't tell you have to automatic doors. I was very pleased to see when I was writing my stuff in this morning that there was one here at your city hall. All right, a couple of things. In Illinois, it's something that you really have to consider because under Illinois Accessibility Code, we have an external door force. And it's very difficult to meet that external door force without an automatic door. The ADA doesn't have an external force, but Illinois put that into their state code. So I need to look at that issue or whatever, okay? But I should, if I don't have that, I should still have a way or a method for people who can't get in the door independently to be able to get assistance. So a doorbell or something on the front door that would connect to the clerk's office or to something so that somebody could ring that bell And that would be alert to the fact that there's somebody at the front entrance that needs assistance to get in to the building. You know, that could be an alternative to an automatic door. All right, make sense? All right, any other questions? Yeah, the swimming pool rabbit hole is a huge one. And I've gone down that hole many times. Okay. Again, plan ahead, give notice of auxiliary aids and services as we talked about. Understand that you may need to modify your policies, practices, and procedures to make sure that you're accessible for people with disabilities as well. So things like must be in person versus can I do it over the phone? So if I have certain forms that have to be filled out, or certain things that have to be done, and you require them only to have to be in person, but the person can't get into City Hall during 9 to 5, transportation issues, et cetera, due to their disability, can we offer any alternatives for them to do that? Can we offer a phone option or other kinds of options? So I need to look at how. Now, I wouldn't have to offer that to everybody. This would be only on the basis of the person having a disability who would need that accommodation. Okay? If I have a situation where, let's say we've got people line up to sign up, and I know this happens at the Forest Preserve, when you open up your dates, people line up like crazy to sign up for their shelters or for their campsites or whatever, on the deadline date or whatever, and you get these long lines. And you have people with disabilities who it's very difficult sometimes for them to stand in those long lines for long periods of time. Can we offer an alternative? The Secretary of State office, if you ever go to the driver's license, offers a separate area for people with disabilities to go, and then they can sit, and then they have a number, and they're called on by number, instead of having to stand in line, to get up to that kind of thing. So, that's a modified policy, practice, and procedure for somebody to do something different. So think about how you might be able to do those kinds of things, because those are required as I review and look at my policies, practices, and procedures in my assessment. How and what could we potentially modify?
We did put that online though, so people can do it online.
I know. I was part of that committee. So, yeah. So, but I was just using an example because that's something that you have to look at. Here's a policy sample. We often ask about things like service animals. What's your service animal policy? Amazingly enough, a lot of municipalities don't even have service policy at all. But it's something that you should consider and should look at. And also whether you make a distinction between emotional support animals and service animals. So this is just a sample policy that is kind of best practice of what that might look like, that distinguishes for the public and for your entity as to where do we allow service animals, where do we allow emotional support animals, do we allow emotional support animals at all, anywhere, et cetera, and how are those addressed. So think about those kinds of things this is just a sample. People have asked us to provide them some samples in the past of what one might look like. Snow removal, huge issue, not this one too, so far, not on metal. But snow removal. What are your snow removal policies as it relates to people with disabilities? What are your snow removal policies in relationship to those things that the city controls and operates? A big issue for streets and sidewalks. Yes, you might have a policy. Do you have a policy where business owners in the commercial area and residential areas are required to remove their snow within so many hours or whatever, of a storm? Do you enforce it? That's a huge issue, whether or not. What about at all those curb cuts when the plows come along and plow in the curb cut? So yeah, the street has been plowed, the sidewalk has been shoveled, except at the curb cut. So I can go everywhere, that as long as I'm between the two curb cuts, I'm fine. But I have no way to cross the curb cut, to get into the street, to cross the crosswalk, to get to the other side. It's my obligation. That's my street. That's my curb cut. That's not the resident's curb cut. So I need to look at what are my policies, practices, procedures for snow removal in those kinds of issues. Again, specialized services we've talked about already. Remembering you cannot force somebody to do those. But if you do have specialized services, etc., what do they constitute? What are they made up of? Who's eligible to participate in them? What standards are we using? If somebody says they have a disability and wants to participate in that program, what are we using as criteria for their participation or their verification that they're eligible to participate in that program, especially if you have any reduced fare programs or reduced cost programs. Some municipalities waive city sticker, fees for your cars, for people with disabilities. What's your criteria? that you're using for that. All of those kinds of things you need to look at when you have those kinds of specialized programs. All right, questions about this part, for this section? I know it's a lot of information. It's overwhelming, I know. So the other checklist I want to just identify to you is that I included the general non-discrimination checklist for you, the next one. This one walks through and talks about all your policies and procedures and asks you questions about policies, practices, and procedures that you may need to think about. And so it's kind of a trigger point to think about things you might, that effective communication issue. People meet, with municipal staff to obtain information, by appointment or by walk-in. We have to make sure that things like the counters are accessible, for somebody who's wheelchair. So, a portion of our counter needs to be lower, and so, do we have that, or we do not have it? Or do we have an alternative place that we can serve somebody in a wheelchair? It's not acceptable for your staff to be standing up here and talking over to somebody that's down there at their counter. They need to be at the same height. And if I need to pass papers back and forth or whatever, it needs to be at that height. It's not appropriate for me to have to reach over or whatever. So you need to really be looking at those kinds of things, and that's part of your programmatic access. Again, accessibility of your waiting area. I talked already about things like kind of chairs that you have. Having chairs available in general for people who have difficult standing. Do you have a notification process for when it's your turn? Can I provide assistance for people filling out forms? Highly recommended that you have a signature plate type thing at your available for people who are blind or low vision who need to sign. Or somebody who has spasticity, and it's just a signature plate that you put over where the signature is needed so that the person can direct their pen in the appropriate place to put the signature on and such. It's very easy to have. You can make it out of cardboard, you can make it out of whatever to have it, but having something like that available is very much a help to people for assistance in filling things out or signing their names on things. And again, making sure you have the auxiliary aids and services that people may need. So if somebody's made an appointment and says, I need a sign language interpreter for that appointment, you need to arrange a sign language interpreter for that appointment. So, and that meeting. Again, making sure that your materials are alternative formats. Alternative formats can mean different things depending on people, their needs. It could be electronic. I want everything electronic as long as it's accessible. I want everything in large print, which means that you're going to ask that person, how large do you want it? Our rule of thumb is, in our practice in our organization, and we highly recommend it, is all your documents and things that you hand out to the public or you use with the public are saved in a shared folder. And they are in your basic Word format. And anyone can go in, grab that document, select all, change the font size to 22, or whatever it is, and you now have large print. It doesn't have to look pretty the way the other document does, or anything. It just needs to be functional for the person who needs it. So think about it, you have this obligation to create it if somebody requests it or needs it. There is no standard to large print. For some people, they may need 18 point. For other people, they may need 22 point. For somebody else, they may need 32 point. It depends on their level of vision, their vision loss. If you have bulletin boards, displays, and things of that nature, make sure that the information that is on those is available in some other format. If I'm blind, I can't read what's on your display. So if you put all of your announcements on, events of the day or whatever on the bulletin board, you better have that someplace else. That better be posted on a website or in some other format somewhere else that people can access that information, that the bulletin board is not the only place that somebody can come and get that information. Again, making sure you have your sign language interpreters, knowing about advanced requests and how you're going to deal with them. What about those circumstances when you're not providing sign language interpreters, or you can't provide sign language interpreters? That doesn't mean you're still absolved of any responsibility. To think, how can you still communicate with that person? Written format, typing back and forth on a computer, or whatever is effective for that person and you to be able to communicate. So you have to really train. This is about staff training and making sure staff is familiar and aware of that. Understand that the ADA does not require anything about certified interpreters or anything of that nature. However, the state of Illinois does. The state of Illinois requires that you use certified interpreters in the state of Illinois. That means you can't pull somebody off the street who has just finished, their first course at the local park district on sign language and say, hey, come and do sign language for our city council meeting. That person is not qualified under the state of Illinois law to do that. You need to hire a certified interpreter, certified under the state of Illinois certification program to do that. So understand that is a requirement at the state level. It's not an ADA requirement. ADA says just a qualified interpreter. The state says it must be a certified interpreter. Understand that there's different kinds of specializations in interpreting. Legal information versus medical information may not be relevant in your situation, but let's say if we're holding, our public health department's holding a health fair of some type, I may need to have somebody who's a sign language interpreter with knowledge of medical terminology. It's not something that everybody has. Again, negotiate your rates, timeframes, et cetera, with whoever your vendors, et cetera, are. This is just sample language of a notice for requesting accommodations in several potential, again, hard to see on the screen, but things like accommodation requests can be directed to inserting the name and the telephone number or the email by a certain date. Requests for sign language, interpreter, real-time captioning, or materials in alternative formats should be made logo later than insert the date to whoever, insert their name, at a phone number or email. So these are just sample ways that you can write it. There's no one right or wrong way to do it. These are just suggested language. This should appear on everything that you put out about a meeting or event. Not just once or whatever. Anywhere that that appears, that notice, so that anytime anybody sees it, they can see that they have a notice requirement in place for accommodations. If you have an automated phone system, understand that you need to address how is it going to deal with TTY calls or calls like video relay or anything of that nature that might come in. More and more people are moving away from TTY because there is less and less people using TTYs. TTYs are telecommunication devices for the deaf. They are a manual device similar to like a fax machine. The two machines talk to each other. Two fax machines talk to each other. Two TTYs talk to each other. But people who are deaf and hard of hearing struggle with communication and accessing people with communication. What we're seeing more and more is entities are moving to SMS or text communication options available for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, where they have a SMS or a text option that people can do. Because people who are deaf and hard of hearing are using their smartphones for their communication. That they're using FaceTime for sign language. They're using text and stuff to communicate. They're using email to communicate because it's much more effective and much more efficient than a TTY is, which is a very clunky and less efficient piece of equipment. How does your staff know how to use these services? Have they been educated? Do they know how to take a TTY call if one came in? Do they know how to take a telecommunication relay call if one came in and how they would call somebody by relay? Illinois has a central relay system called 711, and it's national. Anybody can use the relay system using 711 from any phone, anywhere. So if I get a staff person who's got a call from somebody who says that they're the deaf and hard of hearing, need to call by relay, this is the phone number to call. That person should be calling 711 and giving that phone number because they're going to serve as your relay service. So these are things that are staff training and things that need to be part of your policies, practices, and procedures. And again, who do you have designated? Most people don't have phone for the public anymore because everybody has cell phones. But if you had a designated phone for the public, you need to have an accessible phone for the public as well for people with disabilities. Understand, and I've already talked about technology, people with disabilities are using a lot of things, magnifiers, screen readers, etc. Smartphones have a lot of this built into them already. Making sure, again, whatever you're using that's electronic, that you're communicating and you're accessing apps, kiosks, websites, etc., are all accessible to people using a variety of different types of technologies. Again, effective communication needs to be effective for whatever equipment. This includes your social media. How many of you use social media in your local government? What are you using? Facebook? Twitter? Anybody tweeting? Instagram? Okay. Huh? Nextdoor. Okay. Be sure that whatever you're posting is accessible. So for example, most of you probably don't know this. When you're tweeting, and we use hashtags. Hashtags in lowercase are not accessible to people with disabilities who use screen readers because a screen reader cannot differentiate the words in a hashtag. you should use camel case hashtags. Camel case means that every word should be capitalized. So if I'm hashtagging VADA, it should not be lowercase v ADA. It should be capital T, V, THE, capital ADA, so that my screen reader reads it correctly. And that's called camel casing, which means that the first initial of all words should be capitalized in a hashtag for it to be accessible to persons with disabilities. If you are posting video on any of your social media, it better be captioned at a minimum. If you are posting images on your social media, they better have alt tags on them. What I mean by that is they better have an alternate text tag on the image. Now, each of the platforms has accessibility features built into them, but they're only as good as you using them. So all of the platforms have a way to add alt tags. But if you don't use that tool, your image is not going to be accessible. So somebody who is using and visiting your Facebook page or your Instagram or whatever cannot and does not know what you've posted, if you've posted images or a video that's accessible. So these are all part of your communication obligations. If you're using social media, and this is probably one of your most vulnerable points for your citizenry, is they see you using inaccessible social media, and they're trying to connect with you. Again, video having to be accessible. Any video that you're using, we've already talked about it. Anything that you're also communicating orally, like on radio or recordings or things of that nature, you need to make sure that they're accessible. So if you're doing a radio or only a sound recording or something of that nature, make sure that you have a transcript of that available. Again, any internet information needs to be accessible. Strongly advised that you use, now, give you a little heads up. If you want to just see how bad your, and I'm not going to say how good your website is, I'm going to make assumptions. What problems your website has, there is a website called Wave, wave.webaim.org that you can run your URL through, and it will give you an excellent picture of where you've got problems. And it's free. So if you just want to get a picture of where your problems are, so you can say, we have got problems and you need to turn this over to IT or to, to wherever to do that, it's just a quick thing to run through Wave.
Can you repeat that website again?
Yeah, sure, it's wave.webaim, all one word, .org. So it'd be www.wave. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I sometimes forget that www thing. All right. Again, remember your brochures and things that you hand out. You must have an alternative format for it. So if you have a stack of brochures sitting in the front lobby, or you have a stack of brochures you've handed out someplace, you're taking to an event or something of the nature that's promoting activities, you better have an accessible format available. You better be able to send it to somebody electronically. You better have it in large print available. And if somebody requests it in Braille, how am I going to produce it in Braille for somebody? All of these things are your calendars, anything that you have on your website or any other way must be accessible. You need to have a website accessibility statement. Even if you're not fully accessible on your website, you need to have a website accessibility statement that reiterates your commitment to website accessibility, what standard you're using, either 508 or WCAG, and a way for if people identify inaccessible content on your website, who can they contact about it? And this is just a sample that I did. You'll be able to see it better in the handouts because it's really hard to see on this this document. All right, transportation. Those of you that offer transportation, make sure if it's part of an event, just occasional or whatever, if it's part of emergency planning, all of that needs to make sure that it is accessible and that you're providing equivalent services to people with disabilities that are available to people without disabilities. And if you have a specialized program, it's fine to have a specialized transportation program for seniors, people with disabilities, eligibility criteria in place. That's fine. You can have those kinds of programs. Just make sure that there's no barriers there for people with disabilities. Again, for public transportation, if you're involved in any public transportation, many of you have bus stops in your area from PACE and things of that nature. Remembering that that's a situation that it's your space and it's PACE coming in. Your liability and obligations are the same as PACE's are. Those bus stops and the sidewalks and stuff that are serving those bus stops are part of your programs and services in your community. And if you're doing it in public transportation, making sure your drivers are trained, et cetera, how to work with people with disabilities. Emergency procedures are really a critical area to make sure you're including how our emergency. Now, this is not just a tornado, This is a fire. This is a flood. This is a power outage. This is a chemical spill. This is anything that could happen in an emergency situation in your community is covered in this scenario, all right? And I need to make sure how are people with disabilities included in this, from everything from sheltering in place to power access, how do I know that if power's been lost and I've got somebody who's on a ventilator or somebody who's on, oxygen dependent is using an oxygen regulator, what kind of prioritization is being given, what kind of services are being given, how do we know, what are we doing about that, how are we transporting, if transportation needs to be had. One of the things that some communities are doing, and I just used the city of Chicago as an example, is voluntary registries. You cannot require people with disabilities to register with you, but you can establish a voluntary registry that allows people to identify to you that they have a disability, what their specific needs are, electricity, oxygen, physical mobility, etc. That then is linked to your emergency responders. So when a call comes in at address blah, 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 it pops up and shows, hey, this person's on the registry. This is the needs of what I'm going to find when I go into that scenario. When we have a power outage, we pull up a geographic area. Everybody in the registry shows up that might have a power issue or something of that nature. So this is voluntary. You cannot require people to do it, but it is a very effective program and it's been used very effectively for weather emergencies, for all kinds of different things it's a possibility for. So it's something to consider. We also see the city of Chicago uses it for both older, aging, and for people with disabilities, but it's totally voluntary and it's been very effective for them. This is just an example. If you wanted to visit their website, there's a link to it in the PowerPoint when they have, shows you what it looks like and what the language is and what the form and what the questions are that are asked in that. And it's managed by their Office of Emergency Management. Again, make sure that you're looking at things like, are you providing funding to shelters or to anything of that nature? If any money is coming from your city to a shelter, whether it's a temporary or whether it's a long-term or only winter or whatever, you're hooked. If you're providing the money, that is a service that you are providing because you're funding that service. Somebody else is carrying it out on your behalf, but it's still your service. So any of these kinds of things need to be included to make sure that they're accessible. What are their policies and procedures? Are they allowing service animals in? Are they allowing emotional support animals in? What are they doing for physical accessibility? All of those kinds of things need to be addressed because it is a program or service of yours that needs to be looked at. If there's transportation being provided to help people evacuate an area, is accessible transportation? Do we have a relationship with PACE that they'll help us transport or whatever else it might be with their accessible vehicles? What kind of relationships do we have with other organizations that might have accessible vehicles that could be put into play in an emergency? Maybe you have a disability organization that has a vehicle that you could have a relationship with them that says, hey, when this happens, we'll contract with you to help mobilize and move people around. Make sure you include people with disabilities in your emergency planning process. How do you know what their issues are unless you can hear from them directly? So make sure that they are included in them. And how are you communicating emergency information? The blaring horn for the tornado or whatever is not well heard by somebody who's deaf. So what are you using? Are you using text, mass texting? Are you using robocalls? What are you using? Are you including accessible communication in those things? And again, this is where that registry goes in a long way because you can have access to what are those people using for communication? How can I link those systems in to our emergency systems for notification of storms and things of that nature, tornadoes, again, chemical spills, whatever, blocked roadblocks, road areas that are blocked or whatever else it might be. This is just a list, all of those kinds of things, got ahead of myself. Again, we've talked a lot about outsourced. Any outsourcing that you do, you are obligated to. They're doing it on behalf of you. They are included in your program access. They need to be included in your review. So if you're giving money out for entities, again, remember the clause in the ADA that says, a Title II entity cannot provide financial assistance to an entity that discriminates against people with disabilities. So if you have block granting or you have any kind of granting that you're doing to external entities, you need to make sure that those entities are not discriminating against people with disabilities. Have assurances in your agreements with them. When you're giving out the money, hey, carrot and a stick. Want our money? You agree to do X. Have some assurance that they're going to do that so that you feel comfortable that you could go back on them or whatever. Because remember, if a complaint's filed, both of you got liability. All right. Again, do they have an eligibility criteria or anything that would potentially, are they providing goods and services? I'll use an example. I use this porta potty example. The city of Chicago contracts with an external entity to bring porta potties in for their events and activities and things of that nature. It's an external entity bringing in, but it's being used for their events and activities. They have Maxwell Street every Sunday. I don't know if somebody probably been down Maxwell Street, but it's not where it used to be. But anyway, it's along Jefferson Street. And they bring in porta potties for it every Sunday. So they get delivered on Saturday and then get removed on Monday or Tuesday or whatever. And I live in that neighborhood. And so one day I was driving by, and it was at the beginning of the season, and I looked at it and I'm like, there's no way somebody could use that accessible toilet because where the contractors placed the accessible toilet was between this was on the sidewalk, but there was a sculpture right in front of it. So there was no turning radius in front of the door of the accessible toilet. So while the contractor brought the accessible toilet, which they were contracted to do, they didn't place the accessible toilet in the correct placement so somebody could actually use it. The city was liable in that situation. I did contact the city about that issue and did get fixed. But, you know, that's a liability issue. Your contractor was the person who did it wrong, your service and program that you're providing for that activity. So make sure that those things are covered with your third-party outsourced services. Again, things that, there are some things that are not covered in the ADA standards, things like vending machines and stuff of that nature. Again, if you have the opportunity and the option because you have a program access obligation, look to see if you can obtain accessible equipment and accessible services because you have an obligation to ensure that they are. So even though the ADA doesn't have specific standards for furniture, movable furniture, you know, the ADA from an accessible standards issues is if I turn the building upside down and shake it, everything that falls out is not covered under the ADA standards because it's not part of the, you know, the built environment. But furniture and things of that nature, they're very much a part of the usability of that activity, program, and service. So you need to take those things into consideration. If you have a vending area, you need to take into consideration, are you contracting for an accessible vending machine? And there are accessible vending machines. The vendors have them. You just need to ask for them and make sure that they're providing you those and such. So these are all things that you need to make sure that you're also including in your assessment and your review of your program access. We've already talked again. Whoops, I'm going back. All right. Public input. Be sure. This is the most critical, important thing that you can do. We all know that it's not a problem until it's a problem. And one of the ways we know about our problems is those people who are most impacted by the programs and services that have a problem. So by getting public input all along the process as to where do we have barriers, what do you think about our, our thought? What do you think about, you know, how should prioritization and stuff of nature definitely should be including doing it at the beginning, in the middle of your process, getting, you know, feedback as, hey, you're finding, are you on track? Are we consistent with what you're finding? And also about what recommendations that you have. So you can do that through public hearings. You can do that through meetings with certain constituencies. So you might have a meeting specifically with people with mobility impairments. You might have a meeting specifically with people who have hearing or vision impairments or whatever it might be to get their specific feedback around certain issues that you might be dealing with. So for example, if you're going to be installing and doing your public rights of way and doing audible signals, you want to get feedback from them. If we're going to do prioritization, where do we want them? You definitely want to pull in the blind community in regards to prioritization as to where you would install those first, as an example. Surveys are another great way to do it. Make sure your survey is accessible. If you're using an online survey or anything of that nature. Again, if you have advisory committees, many communities have advisory committees, you might want to even create an advisory committee for this process. Look to advocacy groups in your community, Centers for Independent Living. We're going to be providing you with a whole list of organizations and entities in the Chicagoland area that serve people with disabilities and are made up of people with disabilities to potentially tap into. But you also may know of others in your own community, definitely tap into them. Advertise. come on, so we're looking for people with disabilities to give us feedback. We're amazed what you might get for feedback on that. So it's really important. I know that I covered a lot of information and material today. It's really hard to cover this stuff in 4 hours or 3.5 hours or whatever. It's overwhelming, and I understand that. I talk fast, that's because I have a lot to say. So I apologize if that was an issue for you. We're going to spend this last couple of minutes just really talking more about the impact and some resources that are available for you and that we're going to be making available for you. And then we'll open up here to open questions to see if there's any additional questions that anybody has.
I think sort of to wrap this up, it's important that we remember sort of what the final goal of this is. We talked about a lot of stuff, and it's overwhelming. I've heard this speech a couple different times. I'm still overwhelmed here again. But I think it's important to remember what that end goal is. And that is that all your citizens can take part in all your program services that you offer. And this is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it's really important that you set that long-term goal so that you can start working towards your long-term goal. And that long-term goal is that accessible community. Resources-wise, these are all links. We also handed out a bunch of resources today. That Title II Toolkit is a great place to start. If you're looking for a place to start, you go back to your office, you're like, okay, where do I start? Title II Toolkit is a great place to start. The Technical Assistance Manual as well. If you're interested in the more legal side of the ADA, Project Civic Access is really interesting. If you're a small community, if you're less than those 50 employees, they prepared a specific guide for small towns. Yes. Yep.
And they're all active links.
Yep, so no need to write this down. This is all going to go out on CMAP's website. You can pull everything that you need from there. Listen, it's not one person writing. It's like, yeah, that's not good. So Title II Action Guide, Title II Tutorial. There are webinars every week. If you get signed up for it, you just get emails. And if there's one that's of interest to you, you can watch. There's ones dedicated just to playgrounds. There's ones that's dedicated just to employment. It's a good way to sort of start to learn about the areas that you want to know more about. We also provided what we thought were sort of good examples of ADA transition plans. Tacoma, Washington, Evanston, Bloomington. There are communities that have done this. I think it's really important that everybody knows that this is doable. And those communities are there. I would encourage you to reach out to them if you have a specific question. I think communities that have gone through this, what I found is they're very open to having that communication.
Yeah, the only thing I would say also is that we've designated something developed by the staff where they did it internally versus where they used an outside consultant. Because you will see a big difference when there's been an outside consultant used versus when it's done by staff. So I think it's important to look at that if you're considering going one way or the other. Take a look at what those products look like and how they're different and what might serve you best. So that's why we designated whether they're staff developed or consultant.
So continuing on, 3 more, as you can see on the side of that slide. So like for Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, contractor developed. Sort of that information. As you leave today, I would encourage you, as just a starting point, go back to where we started in the beginning of this. Designating that responsible person, grievance procedure, notice to the public. There's a lot of other stuff that we talked about after that. To me, those 3 things are wherever you can start this process. So if you leave with nothing else from this, if you can get those 3 things, that's your first step in the right direction. And Robin's information is on here. Great Lakes ADA Center is going to be a resource for you in this. Robin and her staff are fantastic. They have answered these questions before. My computer decided it's time for this to be over. So apparently it's time for us to stop talking, which I can't disagree with it. So with that, sort of again, those goals that we had in this presentation. Number 1, hopefully you guys have a history of the ADA, that knowledge back to, it started in the 60s and how we got to where we're at today. Really, those 5 key administrative steps are sort of what we're looking at here. Self-evaluation, transition plan, and then really taking a look at those programs. Every community has a lot of programs. This is going to take time, but I guarantee that you can do this. Ask questions, reach out to people you need to reach out to. Great Lakes, CMAP, whoever it is, reach out for that help, because this can be done. Big things are upcoming ADA coordinator training is going to be on March 1st. We don't know specifically where that's going to be located at, but March 1st is going to be ADA coordinators. April 18th and 19th is going to be public right-of-way.
Sure, there's one that you're reading, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it will be in your website.
Yes. Yep, that'll be on that website. And then we have a link in here to CMAP's website. And CMAP's website is sort of the key. You can register through them. All the information is going to be on there, resources, everything else. So April 18th and 19th is all things public rights of way. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I know 3.5 hours is a lot of time, but you guys were a great audience. I thought we got some great questions. And with that, just open it up at the end for any questions that anybody might have.
Or any thoughts that they have, in regards to challenges that people perceive, where are the challenges that people see for yourself? Is it the getting buy-in from the top? Yeah, so I'm seeing, yeah. It's an overwhelming, process, and it's time consuming. And it is potentially resource consuming, both time and potentially money, because even if you don't go with an external contractor, it's still staff time and having to kind of probably redirect some priorities and things of that nature. I think, the thing, and I don't like to dwell on the negative side, is that to understand that there is liability here in regards to the fact that, the disability community has become very empowered and are, not shy from raising these issues as they see, where the little thing I handed out today says 33rd anniversary. In July, we're celebrating the 33rd anniversary of the ADA, so you do, need to be aware. And I think sidewalks and curb cuts and things that have been long neglected in the area, where a lot more has been done in buildings and facilities and have been done in the public rights of way. So you have quite a bit of liability out there as people are using, your sidewalks and streets and stuff as well. And something that is repaired on a regular basis, and even if you repair them and don't fix the problems, that's a problem. So, question about it.
I don't know if my situations are consistent with others, but my biggest hurdle is just lack of interest from leadership in my organization. And is there any resources you guys can, the liability angle is, I need help putting the fear of God. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, accessibility is a priority to me because of the messaging angle and all kinds of other stuff. Like, I get it. I don't need to sell myself on why this is important. But selling a bunch of Ubers, no offense, on why this is important and a priority and everything like that is a challenge. And it's especially coming from a municipality that's very tight with releasing resources for things. It's being able to cite specific case study examples. Here's a town in Illinois, in the suburbs, that got sued because they didn't deal with this situation, and here's what happened to them. Having those case study examples to be able to point to help sell why this is important and is necessary.
And I don't know if
other than just saying, this could happen, those specific examples would be helpful.
We could definitely provide you some of those for sure. And I don't think this would be the suburbs. I mean, I don't know how many people are tracking, but right now the city of Chicago is 4. One that is mostly resolves the curb cut one, that happened 10 years ago. And they are still in court monitoring over it because they have not done what they were supposed to do to remove their sidewalk, their curb cuts, or do their curb cuts. They are, this last year, one for audible signals, and the failure to install audible signals at crosswalks. So that's a Department of Justice. It was filed by a group of individuals with disabilities, and the Department of Justice came in and joined the case, which is not voted well for the city in that particular situation. They just got a housing one for their public housing that it was actually been on the books since 2018, but the judge is basically said that he's sick and tired of the city's rhetoric on that case and is pushing it and advancing it forward, kind of thing. So this is an ongoing thing. And then they have another one related to their website. So for accessibility issues of their website, specifically their third-party payment portion where they were tax pay and different fees and things like that on their website. So, those are great, great. Nobody wants to be in that, in those situations, so.
The honest, like coming from Western,
Yeah.
who suffers
Yeah.
where I'm at, like Chicago's constantly being sued
Yeah, I
by
know.
somebody for something all
I know,
at all
I know.
times. So that
I
example
know, would
feels
be,
a little
I know.
out there.
I know, I would agree.
What my circumstances
Yeah.
are,
I would agree, but we can share, there are some, Gurney, Illinois, was subject to Project Sigma Access. They had a pretty rigorous one.
Pekin, Illinois,
Pekin.
which is downstate, but they're going through this right now.
Yeah.
It's a 30, 40,000 person community
Yeah.
who's going through this.
Yeah. So we can share some examples for sure. Yeah, and again, if I was to put my advocacy hat on you and ask me the question, I said, well, let me come into your community and identify a few people with disabilities and I'll meet with them and talk to them and have them file a complaint against you. Because, hey, nothing better than a complaint gets some attention, type of a thing. So, yeah. I know, I totally agree. Back here.
Yeah, I know you kind of focus on the good, bad, and ugly part of municipalities or different governments not responding, but typically if a resident or a citizen complains to a municipality, are most municipalities responding and not just ignoring them where it's all turned into a case?
Yeah, I think that the problem is when you do that approach of individualized response by individualized response, all that happens is that problem right there gets fixed. So I, as a citizen, complain about the curb cut on my corner gets fixed. Well, great, that serves me, but that doesn't serve the rest of the community and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that we do find that communities are responsive, when things are brought to their attention, but that's not a very effective way to manage it. Why should people? I'm going to come back with the fact that why should a person with disability have to complain in the first place? Why should it be my responsibility to be the police of what you're supposed to do? That's an additional burden on me as a person with a disability that doesn't exist for a person without a disability. That's not fair. That's not equitable. You're treating me as a second-class citizen that my issues are not as important as somebody else's issues. So,
I'm not saying municipalities should ignore it. I'm saying, like today, you put a lot at us.
yeah,
And a lot of stuff I learned, I'm going to take it back. But it's a process, what
Yeah.
I'm saying is.
And we
In
know-
other words, in my opinion, I'm speaking in general, most municipalities want to comply to certain things and accommodate everyone, not just throw the nose up to forget it.
Right, right.
So I'm just saying it's just a process, that's all I'm asking.
right, and that's,
It
right.
sounds like most municipalities do comply. And of course, we want the curb cuts, we want the various things that, to be accommodating, obviously.
Right, I agree, they just haven't been a high priority, because the reality is, if I start counting years back, this is the 50th anniversary of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So 50 years, you've had obligations under 504 as long as you took federal dollars, okay? Then, this is the 33rd year of the anniversary of the ADA. So you've had 33 years to do these issues under the ADA. So you've got to see where the tolerance of, we want to do it, but you haven't done it for 50 years or 33 years. So there's a little edge and a little tension there, around that issue. Again, you weren't here 50 years ago. You may not even have been here 33 years ago, so it wasn't your fault. But the issue is somewhere along the line, there's accountability here that we've got to say, all right, here's the line, we draw it in the sand. Here we were not accessible, we weren't doing what we needed to do, we weren't paying the attention and whatever that we're supposed to do. That all changes. And from here on out, we're going to do it. We're going to develop a plan. It may take us 10 years. It may take us 15 years to get there. But at least we're moving forward, and we're not just still sitting back and saying, oh yeah, it's something we should do, but we just haven't done it yet. I mean, that's where we need to get you to. You know, that's where we hope to get you to, is that you at least start to develop those programs and plans, develop the strategies to look at these things in your organizations. And the good thing here is that should come out of this would be that in the end, from here on out, every new program or service that you develop should be looked at with the same lens. So that you are, from here on out, all of the things that you're doing are accessible, that you're not having to retrofit anymore. That you're proactively doing things and not just putting a fire out or a Band-Aid, you know, on something. So we recognize it's definitely a process. You're applauded just for being here, you know, and recognizing that you need to do something. That's the first step in the right direction. And we totally understand because I have been in those council meetings. I have stood up in front of a council before where I've been lambasted about why should we have to spend this money for only a few people in our community. They've actually said that to me, you know? So I know that mentality, I know that thought process, you know, and we just have to figure out ways to change those minds, vote them out and get new people in, you know, and or unfortunately, the end result being you do get a complaint filed against you, and the only one who's going to make out from there is whoever you have as your attorney for your municipality. They are the only one who will make out in those situations. Anything else? We'll go forth and populate.
Thank you.